even after 15 years had passed, simply because the protagonist was the leader of the SA clan. He was cursed by the shamans. Tired of hearing such things, he decided to attack, but because of that, turned into a full-blown war. Even though large-scale battles were happening across the country, he wasn't present because he was solely after the shamans. During that time, the protagonist burned 3 shaman temples, eliminated all the scribes and elders, and killed anyone who insulted him. Yet still he was cursed for being evil, treacherous and brutal. What was ironic, however, was that somehow a truce was reached. But the sacred land of Mudong had weakened. Even the weakest clan Gu was pushed out, but the protagonist didn't care, as he believed you reap what you sow. After that, lying in bed completely ill, the protagonist said that as time passed, his mind became clearer and he could remember the events. He lamented that his life was flashing before his eyes, and that he had always depended too much on his disciples, making them lose everything because of him. But the protagonist noticed that his most loyal disciple wasn't there. He was referring to Qian Wumian. The protagonist believed his disciple was still out, searching for the herb of immortality, and deeply wished to see him before dying. Showing longing and attachment, the protagonist struggled to breathe, saying his time had come as he had turned 80 that year. He recalled his entire journey up to that point, political events, long battles, and how all the affection had been earned by the eternal Hyacinth. He had betrayed the arrogant, crushed the wicked, and even stabbed those who had helped him. Through this cycle, he became the hero of the Saklan. He reflected that even if they called him wicked, he had fought bravely and emerged victorious. He claimed to have had all the women and riches in the world, could destroy an army with a single move, and was the most powerful man alive. But every life must come to an end. And with that, he reflected on how many regrets he had. He lamented spending all the fortune he had amassed, and not having destroyed the factions that turned against him. Sighing, he said, he could hear the sorrowful voices of his disciples, reaching his ears in quiet tones. But it's revealed that more than anyone, his disciples wished for his death, saying his body didn't seem like it would collapse that easily. His disciples celebrated his imminent death, astonished that they had obeyed such a cruel old man for so long. One of his disciples said he had taken care of everything, and the others thanked him, saying they were grateful for all that only Sok Jinju had endured. In disbelief, the protagonist regretted taking that disciple off the streets, and turning him into one of his best. Now faced with his betrayal, his disciples feared that Chun Wuming might return with the herb of immortality, and prayed every night that it wouldn't happen. One of them said they had never seen such a treacherous man live freely, without suffering from old age. After that, the disciples celebrated, believing that if they took care of themselves, they'd be fine. While the old man said he'd rather be strangled to death. Tears in his eyes, he reflected that everyone who cursed him and turned their backs on him felt the same. But as he mourned, a messenger from the underworld appeared by his side, calling his name. Upon hearing it, the protagonist realized it was the first call from the underworld, and by the third his connection to the world would be severed. With that, he concluded that he didn't have much time left, and that he should let go of his bitterness and close his eyes. But to everyone's surprise, protagonist's most loyal disciple came running toward him. The protagonist commented that it was typical of his disciple to abandon everything just to witness his death, and felt happy to have at least one person loyal to him. But before anything else, the disciple revealed that he had found the herb of immortality, which shocked everyone. It made the protagonist question if it was really true, and if he could actually survive quickly. The disciple placed the herb in the protagonist's mouth, telling him to chew it, but the Soul Reaper was still by his side, making the protagonist think someone should shut that Reaper's mouth. Then the disciple removed the herb from the master's mouth, and said he would feed him himself, squeezing the herb into the master's mouth. Seeing that the other disciples rushed to stop him, trying to ensure their master wouldn't survive, suddenly the Reaper made the third call, and the protagonist, still without having swallowed the herb, wondered which of the two would win this race. But in the end it was too late, and he could feel his soul leaving his body. He deeply regretted it, as he wanted to live longer, and had nearly achieved the much-dreaded immortality. He realized that everything was over and irreversible. He had lost his money, his beloved, and his wedding night. But suddenly, to everyone's surprise, The master's soul was being thrown back into his body. However, the Reaper wasn't having it, and began pulling the soul back by the hair. But due to a mistake, he let go of the protagonist's soul. The master mocked the Reaper, saying he should go home and try again in 100 years, because he wouldn't be able to take his soul. The Reaper, still in disbelief, couldn't believe that Hyo-yen was laughing. The protagonist celebrated, claiming that human perseverance was unbeatable, and decided to keep his eyes shut and not move a muscle until the end. He then declared that he was Hyo-yen, leader of the SA clan, the one who defied the heavens. Still with his eyes shut, the protagonist heard murmuring voices, and assumed the Reaper had already gone away. When he opened his eyes, he was shocked by the symbol on the old men's hats, saying that only shamans bore that symbol. Now the protagonist was completely confused. Upon realizing he was lying down, surrounded by several Taoists, while the old men commented that he was truly lucky, the protagonist reflected that since the Reaper couldn't take him, he must have brought him there. He couldn't believe it, until he felt extreme pain and realized he couldn't move his body. One of the shamans reassured him and told him not to move, but the young man thought to himself that his bones felt crushed. Then the shamans revealed that he had fallen off a cliff while trying to find medicinal herbs for his mentor. Suddenly the protagonist began to recall memories of an unknown child being rescued by a woman, and so a glimmer of hope hovered over them. The woman caressing the child was pleasant and kind. When that child's master became gravely ill and bedridden, the boys set out on a journey wandering the mountains to save him. But the protagonist was deeply confused, wondering whose memories those were, and why he was being overwhelmed by them. Yet to everyone's surprise, the protagonist's pulse became unstable, throwing the Taoists into despair. Suddenly the shamans began channeling energy through their fingers to try to heal the boy. Then the protagonist realized they were injecting ki into his body, and thought they were trying to kill him, perhaps under direct orders from the Reaper. But afterward the monks finished treating him, and said that his chi had been concentrated in his dantian for 6 years, and that now he just needed to recover his bones. The boy's master thanked them for saving his life, but the boy thought all those old men were sadists. The other elders said they couldn't ignore the life of the child, who had saved that man's life. After that, one of the elders revealed that now the child had ki within him, and so they should take this opportunity to teach him, and make him a disciple of Namjoon. They said they had been thinking about this for a while, but the boy had no experience, and becoming Manjin's disciple was no easy feat. One of them said, it seemed to be the child's destiny to become a shaman. They asked the master what he thought, and he said he had been thinking about it for a long time, but had delayed it due to his health. But now resolved, he said, that if they allowed it he would train the boy with everything he had. All the old men became excited by his answer, and they gathered together, holding a meeting, where they agreed to let the child become Myunjin's disciple. The master thanked them profusely, and they asked him if he had already chosen a name for the boy, to which he revealed he had chosen Jimu. The protagonist, hearing it all, despaired, thinking that name was awful and that just hearing it gave him chills. The boy wondered why those old men had such a strange hierarchy system, and such bizarre naming customs. Suddenly the old men began making strange hand gestures, saying it was for Jimmy's recovery, and suddenly a ritual began to cleanse the boy's body of all evil, and drive all demons away from him. They continued the ritual, fiercely pleading for the boy to become healthy, while the protagonist was hating every moment of it. Jimmy said they should have just given him a painkiller, instead of starting to chant. In the past, after brutally exterminating everyone, Haokien Mugong became leader of the Saw clan, along with his 2 followers. That was only the protagonist's past. Now, he had become a first-class disciple of a group of declining shamans. Now the protagonist wondered what that Reaper had done to him, because when he opened his eyes, he was inhabiting the dying body of a shaman full of memories. But he was frustrated by the fact that his sacred ki was dissipating all other forms of ki, making it impossible for him to use his former power. On top of that, he always had to fake reactions around his master, having to respond politely every time he was called. But the memories of that body made him act that way. The boy remembered his old days when he was wiping out groups, and that Jimmy had stood before him alone, and that he was the only shaman who kept fighting to save the entire place. And during that confrontation, he remembered that he should have killed him, should have destroyed the entire area and killed everyone. But returning to reality, his master called him for lunch and he replied, yes, without thinking. And when he came to his senses inside that body, being a lord of Murim, he was chopping vegetables and making soup in a kitchen. But soon he grew agitated with all of it and exclaimed in frustration, wondering when he would be allowed to leave that place. Another day passed and there was the protagonist, training with his master using powerful sword techniques, which made his master impressed, as he already wielded the sword in a very peculiar way. The master said that even with years of training, it was difficult to learn that, and only 3 months had passed. And the protagonist said he forgot to mention that he learned. Just by listening to it all, it's revealed that after 3 months of Meijing, having lost his powers, he trained the boy using only words. So the protagonist exclaimed that even for an ancient lord, having to learn everything from scratch was a pain. The boy exclaimed that his cursed body was being controlled by its memories, and couldn't go against the words of his master. So the master assumed the boy was a genius, because when he was taught one thing, he was able to learn 10 or even 100 times more. But he soon dismissed that idea. The protagonist, confident, thought that even in that body, he used to be one of the strongest beings in the world, and that he understood that power much better than that master did. But he admitted that even so, it was fun learning the techniques of that old man. Every day, his skills improved and his understanding of basic movements deepened, and he recognized it was much safer than the techniques he used before, and he admitted that this was one of the reasons that place was so famous after that. The protagonist dove even deeper into his training, saying it was like being young again, because after training for so long, he lost track of time. A year passed, and the protagonist had become a monster in the art of the sword. Cutting a tree in his yard, he brought his technique to its peak. He concluded that now finally he could defeat a first-class disciple. The techniques he had learned had a few oddities, but he admitted they were better than his old ones. But his biggest problem was learning to control his ki. His swordsmanship was already perfect, but even so he was progressing too slowly with ki. He was not satisfied with his progress, and lamented not being able to use his old powers, since his ki clashed and prevented him from advancing. So he concluded that he needed to find a way to use his past experiences to reach the top, and so he decided that he would become a master disciple. 3 days earlier, a boy had been watching the protagonist and said it was impressive that if anyone saw him, they'd say he was already a master disciple. The protagonist noticed that the boy was one of the second-class disciples who took care of supplies, and his name was probably Chung something. That boy mockingly said that if he became a master disciple, he'd be under the direct guidance of the master and could compete for the throne. But the protagonist thought to himself that no one would want to learn from those old men, and he was already losing his patience with that brat. The boy argued that he also wanted to become one, so he could learn high-ranking techniques and control his ki in various ways. When the protagonist heard the boy mention ki, he immediately turned to him and asked what he knew about kiss. Then it was revealed that it was possible to use 2 types of ki at the same time, a technique that only the best of the best could learn, and so he thought that technique had been lost for decades. The protagonist reflects that among all the people he had met, no one was skilled enough to use 2 types of ki, but maybe if someone could teach him, he would be capable. That way he wouldn't have to worry about interference from sacred ki, and could use the dragon soul ki. So the protagonist confirms with the boy that those who become master disciples learn to use 2 kinds of ki, and the boy confirms it, saying everyone knew that. With that, the protagonist burst with excitement, with countless plans running through his mind. But then that boy crushes the protagonist's dreams at the root, saying it was impossible. He says every first-class disciple was trying to become a master disciple, and the protagonist was a nobody. The protagonist didn't listen to him, because the boy didn't know who he really was. So he decides that the stronger he becomes, the better, and he'll beat everyone down until there's nothing left of them. He reflects that he found a way to use his old techniques, and that if he solved this problem, he could leave that place. But the only issue was that he had to make his master healthy again, cooking for him every day and pretending to be a good Samaritan. The protagonist says that Dan Body cared about the master every single day, and that whenever he tried to escape, it forced him to come back. Therefore, if he wanted to leave, The master had to be healthy again, and there was only one way to do it. He had to give his master as much meat as possible, so the illness would heal. But the shaman's custom was to only eat grass. It had been a sacrifice to convince the master to start eating meat. The meat improved his health considerably, allowing him to go out for longer, and making him believe it was the best food for revitalization. Still, the protagonist reflects that he couldn't tell the master his plan. However, if asked, he would end up telling the truth, because that body couldn't lie to the master. But despite it all, after his master recovered, he would learn to use 2 different kinds of ki. Then suddenly, while training, he accidentally strikes a boy attacking on instinct. Clumsy boy asks if he was one of the disciples, but the protagonist quickly notices that guy had arms the size of a thigh and a huge belly. The disciple introduces himself, saying his name, the chubby one, a second-class disciple. He said he had brought food for the protagonist. The chubby guy had brought supplies for the protagonist all. The protagonist thinks that guy must be slacking off in training to have gained all that weight. The protagonist misses the last unlucky one, who used to torment him when bringing supplies, but soon concludes that it doesn't matter anymore. He tells the chubby one to leave the food anywhere, and returns to training, causing the chubby guy to watch him closely. But that bothered the protagonist a lot, so he asked the chubby one if he didn't have anything better to do than stand there watching. The chubby one says he has nowhere else to go and can't train, which makes the protagonist wonder why people didn't hang out with their companions during breaks. So the protagonist asks if there was no one to stay with him, and the chubby one says everyone was busy. The protagonist asks the chubby guy if people usually walk away quickly when he approaches, and the chubby one confirms it, asking how he knew after that. Jimmy asks if the other guy who used to bring food switched with the chubby one, and he says the guy had been too busy lately. Indignant, the protagonist asks why the chubby one always answers while laughing, and he says it's just because he likes to laugh. But thinking it over, the protagonist, looking at the chubby one, remembers someone from his past. That someone was his most loyal and faithful servant, who even laughed when being beaten up. He was the only one the protagonist missed from his last clan. Yet the MC was still confused about what to do with the chubby guy. But in the end, the protagonist just tells the chubby one not to interrupt his training, and not to get in his way. Despite that, the protagonist was genuinely curious to see how a shaman apprentice trained, so the chubby one begins executing a series of heavy strikes. Seeing that, the protagonist recognizes the 7-star fist, and observes that the chubby guy already had all the basic techniques. But there was one fact: the chubby guy didn't account for his body weight since he was fat, making his movements slow. With no choice, he simply directed his movements toward the opponent. An example of this would be if your arms are short, you should use your legs more than the original method. But that wasn't Jimmy's business. After that, the protagonist grew irritated, and corrected the chubby kid's movements. He told him he needed to change the way he moved because he was fat, and his movements would be more graceful if he switched techniques. But the chubby kid didn't understand anything, and the protagonist grew frustrated for not being able to make him comprehend. Unable to explain it properly, the protagonist just pulled the chubby kid by the ears, telling him to follow, then positioning the chubby kid. He told him to simply imitate him. He asked the chubby kid to use the 7-star fist again, saying that now he would teach him and then kick him out. They began circling each other, and the chubby kid quickly prepared his attack, charging in with a straight punch. But before he could do anything, he was struck in the face by the protagonist. The chubby kid was left confused, and the protagonist instructed him not to make useless moves, and to make his strikes faster and more precise. But since he didn't have much of a brain, the protagonist concluded that his body might learn better by being hit, so they went back to training the same move. But the protagonist grew more and more enraged, as he had never met someone so stupid. The chubby kid kept messing up, making the protagonist lose his temper even more, poking his eyes and saying, "There's no such thing as a cowardly way to fight." But after a long time training, they were exhausted. The chubby kid collapsed on the ground, thanking him for the training. The protagonist noticed that the chubby kid had kept moving until he was told to stop, which made him very resilient. However, if you taught him a move once, you have to show him 20 more times before he got it, because he was just that dumb. After that, the protagonist told him never to come back, and to send someone else to bring supplies, because if he returned he'd be dead, thus scaring the chubby kid into running away as fast as possible. Protagonist's wish was for the chubby kid to feel fear and never return, but truly that was all he wanted. For him to be afraid, but suddenly, the protagonist's teacher arrived, saying he had taught the boy very well. Master said he had never seen that fat kid before, but the protagonist just replied that he was simply stupid. However, the master said he had guided the boy well with a shining smile on his face that made the protagonist wonder why he looked so pleased. Faced with that, protagonist said he would hurry to prepare the meal. The next day, the master had gone for a walk and the chubby kid hadn't returned. That made the protagonist feel relieved and think he should take it easy today. But to his surprise, someone appeared calling him a bastard, and with that person was the chubby kid. And that mysterious figure was the great disciple of the primordial Flower Hall Jinho. And if he was right, this man was one of the 7 shaman masters, which made the protagonist question why he was looking for him. Jimin decided to treat Jinho with respect, since he represented the death penalty. But doing so hurt his ego deeply. The master was furious, because cowardly tricks had been taught to his disciple, causing a child to get hurt during training. Meanwhile, the protagonist silently celebrated. Proud of the chubby kid still, the master complained, and the protagonist arrogantly told him to lower his voice, because his ears were already burning. However, he added that what mattered was that he won, and if the master was going to keep spouting nonsense, then he should leave. The protagonist felt there was no issue, as long as the kid's egg didn't crack, and said, the master didn't know him well enough to be yelling like that. But the master sensed something strange about that guy. He looked like a child serving his master, but now he was acting arrogantly. So he reflected on why that boy's personality had changed so much. I remembered that Myung-jin had only taught him using words. That's when he was sure that the training alone had made him arrogant and twisted. After that, the master decided to teach the boy a lesson. Even though he wasn't a member of the royal court, he was determined to guide him because he was the death penalty. But the protagonist didn't back down, and took the opportunity to try to defeat the master, and become famous. However, he couldn't strike the master with a real sword, so he thought of using the sheath, as he had been waiting a long time for this fight. While the protagonist waits for the master's move, the master keeps judging the posture of that arrogant brat. But tired of waiting, the protagonist decides to rush at the master, striking directly with the sword's sheath. Soon the master perceives the protagonist's intent to draw blood. Recognizing the style of the divine gate of 3 swords, the master was being pressured. Noting that the boy's movements were concise and fast determined, the master thinks he'll use the same technique to show the vast gap between them, and put him in his place, keeping in mind that he couldn't hurt him. The master tries to aim for the boy's wrist, but when he strikes, openings appear in his attack, and he reflects on how dangerous that was, since the protagonist blocked it easily. The fight continues, and with the protagonist's cunning, he aims for the master's eyes. The technique the protagonist was using was called the Divine Gate of 3 Swords, intended to disarm or render the opponent unable to fight by aiming only at the wrist. Understanding that, the master wonders why he was targeting only vital points, like the heart and eyes, making it comparable to the cowardly fencing technique of the SA clan. Then the master concludes that it really felt like he was fighting a member of the SA clan, and after much effort, the protagonist manages to counter the master's attack, striking his wrist and sending his sword flying. The master is in disbelief upon realizing he lost the fight, but oddly enough he didn't regret losing, because in the final second, the protagonist redirected the blow to his wrist, even though he had been aiming only at vital spots. That said, the protagonist reminded him of a disciple he once knew, Myung-jin, a man who became a great Taoist master. But while the master was mesmerized by the protagonist's technique, the boy lunges forward with a closed fist and lands a solid punch to the master's face, knocking him to the ground. In complete desperation, the master only pleads for him to stop, but the protagonist is savoring it because to him, fists were the best way to end a fight he had long felt depressed by Myung-jin, and now he could finally let himself go again. The chubby boy watched Jimin with intense focus as he knocked his master out, and after many punches, the master was already unconscious due to his lack of mercy. Chubby One was truly amazed by Jimmy's techniques, since because of his isolation, no one had ever seen him fight quickly. The protagonist tells the chubby one to take the master back to the temple, and after that Jimmy reflects that he had finally taken the first step toward becoming a master disciple, and that the news of him defeating Jinho would soon spread. He believed that no matter how strong you are, you won't defeat anyone if you're held back by morals, and that strength was more important than anything. He had faith that he would defeat all the master disciples, and decided to pursue them with his greed. Inside the Purple Cloud Temple, there was much talk about someone having defeated Jinho. Taoists were very intrigued about it. The shamans were in disbelief upon hearing that a disciple, who had been a student for only 1 year, had managed to use the divine gate of 3 swords, and defeat one of the masters, and even more had taught the chubby one, modifying the 7-star fist so it would suit his body type. And one of the elders reports that due to how much Jinho was beaten, he still hadn't woken up, so the details couldn't be confirmed. But he concludes by saying that's what he heard from the chubby one, causing everyone present to be shocked. The elders were stunned that a mere disciple had been able to modify the 7-star fist, something only possible if you had deep military experience. But they concluded the story was being greatly exaggerated, since the disciple was a poor student. Still, Myung-jin was teaching him, although one of them recalls that Myung-jin had been complaining about their practices. Since a certain event, he said, they had to let go of their humility and make a practical difference. In the past, the wicked Haoyue and Mugong rained terror across the mountains, burning down the 3 palaces and massacring countless disciples. One of the masters says that in recent years, there hadn't been time for Master Meng-jin, as he was busy working with Kayanyang. So they decide to all go to the Forbidden Temple of the Hermit the next morning to hear the protagonist's story. The next morning, the chubby one tells the protagonist that his affiliation had been changed from the Primordial Flower Hall to the Forbidden Temple of the Hermit. He finishes by saying his master had told him to learn a lot from Jimmy, which leaves the protagonist in displeasure, wondering if he hadn't beaten that bastard enough. Thus the hero's master arrives saying that he had approved all of it, so the protagonist accepts. The master explains that the previous night, Jinho came and asked for his permission so his disciple could teach. Now Jimmy reflected that they had convinced that innocent old man while he wasn't around, so the protagonist begs his master, saying that he's not ready to train students. But the master says he already knows the whole story. The master warmly holds the protagonist's hands, which makes the protagonist feel like he's about to be tricked. With sweet words, the master says that Jim has grown a lot, enough to defeat Jinho, and that he's definitely a shaman disciple. He continues by saying that even though he went over the line, his teacher was very proud of his student's achievement. So it was decided that the MC would be the chubby kid's master, and from now on he would have to work hard. After all that, the innocent master says he's hungry and asks if Jim, you could bring him a meal. The protagonist comforts the master, saying he'll bring something soon, while the chubby kid asks how he can serve him, saying he's at his command. Then with a menacing aura, the protagonist says he'll accept him only because it's the teacher's order. But he makes it very clear that he's not his teacher, and that the kid is to follow orders exactly, and that he should never say words like wow again, like last time, growing even more hostile. The protagonist says that if he follows those 3 rules, they'll have no problems, and that he should imagine getting beaten to death if he ever says one of those words again. So then Jimmy sends the chubby kid away, telling him to leave. The kid wonders where to go. Moments later, the chubby kid shows up carrying 2 chickens, saying he got them for his master, and the MC starts getting orders to kill, prepare, and throw them into water. Seeing it all, the protagonist says the chubby kid is obedient, and that giving orders is very satisfying. While cooking, the chubby kid asks his master how he had done that move. The day before, he says he was really surprised, because Jimmy was one of the most illustrious masters in the world, and he just exclaims that it was amazing, and then says it's time to take the food out of the pot. Once again, the protagonist remembers his most loyal disciple, who was just like the chubby kid, clueless and lacking sense, but very loyal. After the food is ready, they go to bring it to their master. While walking, the protagonist reflects that now that he's here, he'll make the chubby kid his number 1 subordinate. But suddenly the chubby kid asks if it's really okay, since eating meat is strictly forbidden. Upon hearing that, the protagonist remembers that it was one of the basic rules of the shaman masters, and that meat was an absolute taboo. Legend said that if you ate meat before the sun rose, your ki would become unbalanced. So the shamans banned it for their disciples. Only one bar made of mixed herbs and grains was allowed. The protagonist reassures the chubby kid, saying it's fine that even he eats it sometimes, and that it's been a while since the teacher had a real meal. As the protagonist brings the food to the master, he reflects that restricting the diet of growing children is a truly wicked thing. Handing over the food, the protagonist tells his teacher to eat and grow strong. Master says that after following the suggestion to eat meat, he's been feeling stronger and even able to take light walks, but it's all part of the protagonist's plan. Once his master becomes strong enough, he will leave the shamans and never come back. The master offers the disciple a bit, but he declines, saying there's enough outside for him and the chubby kid to share. The master asks why he didn't get 3 chickens, so he wouldn't have to share, since he's in the prime of his youth. Then he walks out of the room saying he's very hungry, only to find the chubby kid devouring the entire chicken. Thus begins a chase with Jimmy running after the chubby kid, yelling that he hasn't learned how to share, and that he even ate the soup. But while they're caught up in the chase, the elder masters arrive at the location,
Radiating à deadly aura,
which makes the protagonist wonder why they had to show up right now. In total desperation upon seeing the elders arrive, Jimmy wonders if it's even possible to escape this situation. The elders immediately start hostile, saying they could smell meat all the way from the foot of the mountain, and accusing him of using the master's illness to avoid correction. One of the elders says that, since he was in charge of the moral discipline of the shaman, he would make sure the master found out about this, and there would be a severe punishment. And so they were already on their way to proceed. The protagonist quickly realizes that if they continued, they would see the master in that state. Licking his fingers, he quickly thinks, he can't let something like that ruin his dream of becoming a master disciple. So he falls to his knees begging them to forgive him, saying it was his fault and that his master was ill. But the elders immediately tell him to shut up, and no matter how admirable his love for the master was, he had violated the commandments. That person was already enraging the protagonist, since he wasn't even a great master, and was already gossiping like that, and he'd have his head in his hands. One of the elders questions the master, Mayan Jean, asking what was going on there, since he was the oldest person involved. With the delay in answering, the elder shouts that he demands a response, but with complete seriousness. Myung Jin asks if that crime was really so serious, shocking all the elders and even his disciples, which makes Jimmy wonder if his master had gone insane. Though he was grateful he was on his side with firm resolve, the master tells them to stand as they were, acting as if they had committed a crime. Then the master rises, telling the elders that he seemed to be doing quite well. Now he states that when he lost his powers and was confined to bed, it was an unimaginable pain, and when he saw his brothers dying, he was completely devastated. The master continues, arguing that while they intended to uphold their rules, they were being utterly crushed, and after seeing how easily they lost, everyone asked for a truce, and that was all that was left to them. He adds that they didn't even try to get revenge. Seeing this, the protagonist reflects that, in the past, after the wars, thanks to his efforts, the other groups chose survival over honor. In that battle context, had the war continued, they would have kept growing stronger, until they wiped out all their enemies. So the groups in that reality chose to ask for a truce. Because of that, no one helped the shamans anymore, and now they were forgotten, growing weaker by the day. When they were powerful, everyone helped. But now they were being ignored the second they became weak. Then Jimmy reflects that, even if they try to paint him as a defender of injustice, many of the respected shamans slowly became legends, forgotten by history. Watching his master argue perfectly, Jimmy was anxious to see the outcome of the shamans' debate. The master goes on to say that, the first time the protagonist suggested he eat meat, he was surprised and he insisted, saying he would get better if he ate. And after much effort he ate the meat and it gave him strength. Until recently he had managed to walk through the mountains, which surprises the shamans, as after 10 years bedridden, he was now able to walk. The others reflect on how he had broken the rules, but had gotten better. The master states that change is necessary, and that eating meat would make them stronger, since they couldn't even afford clothes for their disciples. Exalted, the master says, his brother didn't understand that if they kept abstaining, they would grow weak, and the commandments would lose all meaning if everyone disappeared. One of the shamans says that throwing away the commandments was madness. Immensely frustrated, he says the commandments were the history of their identity. But even if he had gotten better, the rules should still be followed. The other shamans agreed with Myung-gong, saying that if they abandoned the past, how could they maintain their pride? But that discussion only brought more uncertainty about their future, until the elder of all elders shouted for everyone to stop. And he says he will handle this himself, and that he wants to speak with Myung-jin alone. Then he tells everyone to leave the room. But since the disciples didn't obey, he shouts again for everyone to leave already. Outside the room, the chubby one asks his master what they should do now. But the protagonist was stunned by the whole matter. After all, they were just eating meat. It shouldn't be that important, as rules and change were so complicated. So he thought his chance of becoming a master disciple was ruined. Then the next day in the main hall, the master says that Jimmy should remain standing before him. The protagonist hoped his situation wasn't too bad, since all he did was eat meat. Then it's revealed that Jimmy had committed 3 crimes, which leaves him stunned because he couldn't remember the other 2. He only had in mind that he was eating meat, which made him seriously question whether he was fit to become a master disciple. The first crime the protagonist had committed, even if it was for his mentor, was going against one of the commandments. The second was that he altered the techniques without permission, and after that taught them to another disciple. The third was that he injured a fellow disciple. With all the judgmental stares, the protagonist concluded that he wouldn't get away with it, and they were looking at him like he was a delinquent, when in fact he could crush them all. He coldly reflected on what punishment he would receive, and what he would do if they took things too far. And the long-awaited punishment he received was to restore the sanctuary of the sword pool, which made the protagonist extremely happy as he had been scared. But that punishment was very light, and they would even overlook the fact that he had eaten meat. The other shamans freaked out when they heard the punishment he received, saying he should be imprisoned and that this was far too lenient. They said the master should reconsider, as he was forgiving him for breaking one of the 10 commandments. But before anything else, the master shouted not to challenge his authority and that he didn't want to hear another word. And after that he ordered Jimmy to leave, which left all the shamans furious. One of the shamans asked permission to pose a question to the master, and he then asked whether the decision he had made was influenced by the effects that meat had on Meng Jin's health. So the master asked if he had ever heard about the Meng Jin case, and the man confirmed, remembering that he had recovered enough to go on walks. He also confessed that forcing the protagonist to do what he should have done himself made him feel ashamed. He vented, saying that for a long time, he had been the doctor responsible for Manjin, and he knew from the beginning that meat would restore his health. But he couldn't break the 10 commandments. He still affirmed that nothing was more precious than a person's life. But the master revealed that this wasn't the only reason. He allowed meat to be eaten, which surprised the shaman. The sword pool and the Jia sword pavilion were the pride of the shaman. No one could enter with horses or weapons, no matter who they were. But after 10 years since the war, that disaster hadn't been restored, and there weren't even guards. The chubby kid noted that something felt off. He said the other first-class disciples had met in the morning, and said they would send some people, but no one was there. Then the protagonist confirmed that they were envious. It's revealed that except for Jim, most of the first-class disciples were descendants of prestigious families, and having someone like him in the same rank wounded their pride. But altering techniques, defeating the MC, and breaking commandments without punishment was unacceptable, because no one likes a stray stone showing up, especially if that stone is a gem. That's when the protagonist concluded that they were trying to bully him, but he couldn't wait to become a master disciple and kick all their asses. Until then, they snapped out of it and remembered they had work to do. Day by day they tried different meats from various animals, savoring each one. Chung Woo said it really was amazing and that if it was okay, they would keep going. Then the protagonist said they had 1 month to fix everything, so they could take their time. He figured they could kill a bit of time. A day passed and the protagonist, while tossing stones into the water, noticed that Chung Woo was late and figured he had overslept. Then suddenly the chubby kid appeared, leaping over the sea, asking if he had been waiting long. Protagonist noticed there was someone with him, which made him question who it was. Then the chubby kid introduced the guy as the brother of Chung Sang, a tall and very charming young man. He realized this wasn't someone who would naturally be friends with the chubster. The chubby kid said that Chung Sang had asked him some things, but he couldn't explain properly, so he had brought him along. The chubby one then explained that the things he learned from his master, he could perform but he couldn't teach them. But the charming young man stared at the protagonist, which made the chubby kid notice and wonder what he wanted. Meanwhile, the elders who were sipping tea commented that Meng Jin said shamans needed to change. One of them said he couldn't believe the chubby kid learned just by hearing the teachings, and when he discovered the weaknesses in the techniques, he adapted them to suit his needs, and that for him to have come this far in just 1 year, he must truly be a gift from the heavens. So they reflect on whether the rules they have imposed on their students had actually clipped their wings before they could even learn to fly. They then decide they want to change, and allowing the consumption of meat would be the first step. And so they wonder what kind of change that would bring, feeling anxious and eager for it. It is said that Chung Sang's brother had learned the 5th level of the sword art. He was one of the few Chungs capable of mastering his sword. Chung Wu points out that his technique was well above average, and that he was the best in his group. But the protagonist notices that he thought he was hot stuff, and didn't even greet him despite being older, and ignored him when he asked his name. So the protagonist was determined to slam his stuck-up nose into the ground. Chung Wu said that others hadn't taught him properly, but is interrupted by a shout from his companion, with a frightening aura. The boy says they don't need to say where he came from, and the chubby one panics, saying he meant nothing by it. Observing it all, the protagonist understands everything. By looking at the angry boy, he realizes that he has talent but comes from a lower status family. That's why he was being excluded. Then Jin Woo becomes annoyed to see that even here, status still mattered, saying he hated what those damn shamans were doing, until he realizes that if he doesn't like it, he can just change it. Until the chubby one is ordered to remove a giant stone. They argued that they needed to restore the sword pavilion, but the chubby one tries to bargain, saying they could waste time hunting rabbits instead. The protagonist immediately interrupts, saying they were being punished. Chung Woo argues that it was a boulder, and it was impossible to move it. Then the boy realizes that moving that boulder would require incredible skill and strength. They were at an impasse as Chung Woo couldn't do it. Then surprisingly, the chubby one lifts the stone and moves it a few meters. This shocks the boy who was watching, and the protagonist sees his reaction and thinks he was probably regretting coming there. Determined to show off, the protagonist walks up to the chubby one and tells him to watch and learn how to do it right. First, Jimmy tells him to lower his stance, then point his foot inward, touch the stone with his knees, and after that he tells him to lift amazingly. The chubby guy lifts the entire stone with his hands and throws it far away into the river. Surprised boy says it was impossible, as he did it just by changing his posture. The protagonist was feeling full of himself, assuming the boy was dying of curiosity to know what had happened. Then it's revealed that the protagonist had touched the chubby one's back and channeled energy into his body. The boy couldn't have seen that, and right after he states that the boy will be even more surprised, then tells Chung Woo to go catch some rabbits. After a while, the three of them are gathered eating their meal. Then Jimmy offers rabbit meat to the boy, but he refuses, saying he couldn't ignore the rules made by his masters. But countering him, the protagonist says that if he ate the meat, he becomes stronger than Chung Woo. Tempted by the offer, the boy stays firm with, which makes the protagonist think he had much more tenacity than the fat one, as he still refused even after curing the claim. So the protagonist notes that one of the 10 commandments was eliminated, seeing that the old men had finally decided to change after so many years, because starting is always the hardest part, and changes will come once the commandments vanish. Besides me, even alcohol and women will be allowed, and the result of this will be corruption. The shamans will start drinking alcohol, with several women by their side. Previously, the protagonist had no idea how to use both techniques, but now he could already see a path to achieving it. He was determined to become a master disciple, and learn to control the types of ki, and corrupt the group of shamans, and then the entire world, because he believed that corruption becomes power, and thus he would rule the world and shape it in his image. And so to do that, He concludes that he would need loyal people by his side, determined to make Chung Sang his second in command. So he concludes that soon, the seeds of corruption would begin to take root, and after they start their training, he calls out to the handsome one, saying he'd get bored if he didn't train with them. But soon the chubby kid said it would be impossible, because Chung Sang was far too powerful for him, since he had already mastered a technique. But ignoring him, the protagonist said that Chung Woo would win no matter what. The long-haired guy couldn't believe that the lowest of the Chungs could defeat him, since he had already learned the way of the sword. But for a first-class disciple, that shouldn't be impressive. Yet many second-class disciples couldn't do what he could. Then he stood up saying, the chubby one was just a rookie, who hadn't even been taught the way of the sword yet. With seriousness in his eyes, he said that second-class disciples were only capable of using martial arts, and that this fight would be just fists and blade. He then confronted Jinmu asking if he looked weak to him, because he was going to make Chung Woo fight him. The protagonist quickly understood Chung Sang's inner self, realizing that he knew he was stronger than the others, but was still trapped at the bottom of a mountain without a rope. So he had come there to see if the protagonist could be his rope, and Jimmy said the fight should happen, deciding he would prove he was worth following using the chubby one. Before the fight started, the charming guy picked up a stick from the ground, and with determination said that his sword had no allies. Hearing that, the protagonist realized how embarrassing it sounded, and thought that if anyone heard him talk like that, they'd think he was some kind of master. However, Jim knew the kid was only putting on a show, which left him surprised. That made the protagonist question why he wasn't using a real sword. This stunned the guy. Realizing the protagonist actually wanted him to use his sword, he argued that, according to the commandments, disciples weren't allowed to fight each other with real swords, but this deeply annoyed Jimu. After much insistence, the protagonist accepted, and whispered something to Chung Woo to do during the fight. However, the big guy was very hesitant to obey those orders from his master, so the MC said that if he didn't do it, he'd killing himself. And he even added that if the chubby kid lost the fight, he'd never eat meat again. Upon hearing that, the chubby kid fell into despair, because he absolutely couldn't go without eating meat. After that, he filled himself with determination, goal in mind, and emitted an aura of confidence. Standing like a bear, the protagonist noticed that Chung Woo's eyes had changed, and that he just needed a little push. The fight had already begun, and Chung Sang had in mind that Jimmy was still younger than him, but he was a disciple of Moon Jin. He reflected that the protagonist had altered award-winning techniques, and had been punished for breaking the commandments, yet he was able to make the chubby one lift a boulder. When the handsome guy trained, he instinctively sensed the flaws in his own technique, but was ignored by others when he asked how to improve, and seeing Chung Woo improve his technique made him question everything. Deep down, he believed Jim Woo might be the answer to all his questions, but when he returned to reality, he realized that all of it was a waste of time, and there was nothing to gain there. Still before that, he was determined to make Chung Woo regret his choice. Chubby One charged forward using his Big Dipper step, trying to strike Chung Sang. But with the long-haired guy's cleverness, he already knew how to counter Big Dipper-style movements, just by identifying where the attacks flowed. Just as he was confident he could break Chung Woo's defense, he was caught off guard when the big guy vanished. Surprisingly, the chubby kid landed a kick on Chung Sang, dodging and rolling to the side before kicking up from the ground. The handsome guy was utterly shocked to see someone like Chung Woo perform the rolling donkey kick, rolling on the ground. Any fighter would consider that technique shameful. The chubby one kept repeating the same move over and over, making the long-haired guy struggle. Chung Woo was striking wildly, always targeting the right hand of the handsome guy, so he couldn't defend or attack. Seeing the whole situation, Chung Sang assumed Jimmy had taught him all those techniques. The chubby one was pleased that his technique was working, doing exactly what the MC had told him to do, and so the handsome one had no way to react. Jim knew that Chung Sang wouldn't be able to handle his attack. Chung Woo knew the handsome guy's strikes were getting weaker, and that he used too much unnecessary force in his moves. At that moment, he was ready to strike for real, slamming his back into his opponent and breaking his sword. After being thrown back and having his sword shattered, Chung Sang finally realized that he had lost the fight, but before he could react, The protagonist starts scolding the chubby one, saying he should have rolled behind the opponent's back. The handsome guy didn't understand the dissatisfaction with Chung Woo, since he had won. Jimmy keeps yelling that in the end, the fat one still got hit and that if it had been a real sword, he would have died. Chung Sang realizes that what the MC said was true, because if he had been holding a real sword, he would have struck the fat guy's neck and killed him. He is surprised by Jimmy's concern, who apologizes for thinking Chung Woo would win, and says he nearly had another corrupted under his protection. But right after that, the protagonist drags the big guy away by the ear, saying he was going to kill him. The hero was making sure the chubby one wouldn't eat another bite of meat for the next 2 days. But the chubby one asks if he did well against a Chung. While Chung Sang watches the scene, he reflects that with all of Jim's flaws, he still wasn't the person he expected him to be. He realizes there was much more than met the eye, thus changing his view of that strange disciple. It had been 4 days since they started the reconstruction. The foundation was ready and all the debris had been removed. However, Jimmy found it odd that Chung Sang was still there, and had brought pheasants for them to eat. Jimmy believed he wouldn't return after winning, but he kept coming to train day after day. The handsome guy was being unusually kind to everyone, asking if his brother had lit the fire yet, which made the protagonist question his change in attitude, since he wasn't like that before, doubting he was okay. That gave Jimmy a chill, since he intended to corrupt Chung Sang. After roasting the meat, the Chung brothers were enjoying it so much that they rubbed their faces against the meat. Jimmy thinks he was an idiot to let them cook the meat, considering they could barely taste its flavor.
Chung Sang ghét Emotinang,
thanking them for letting him taste something like that, and saying he already felt stronger. The hero finds it strange because Sang was being overly flattering, and meat wouldn't have that kind of effect. In just a few days, however, Sang says that the flaws in his technique wouldn't be easy to fix. That's when the protagonist understood Sang's true intentions, realizing there wouldn't be any other reason for him to keep following him. Jimmy comments that his mouth was dry from eating meat, and exclaims that he'd like some water. Upon hearing that, Chung Sang runs at full speed to fetch water for his master, making Jimmy notice that he was quick to understand things. Jimmy had no plans to give Sang great rewards. He would only do enough to satisfy him, since he wanted to mold him into whatever he wanted. Inside Jane Palace, the shamans were freaking out. Upon learning that Jimmy had broken the commandments again, and was still eating meat, disciple Jin Hyo reported that Jimmy wasn't even trying to hide it anymore, and was clearly refusing to learn. So he deserved to be severely punished. The shaman master reflected that, even though meat consumption had been temporarily allowed, all the other disciples were still following the old rules. The disciple continued reporting that, on top of that, the long-haired one was staying with the hero all the time, and had also lost to Chung Woo. The shaman master is shocked upon hearing Chung Sang's name, remembering that he was one of the most prestigious first-class disciples Jin Il-wan's, saying the boy was deceived by Jimu, and that he was very concerned about the negative impact this would have on the other disciples. Thus he suggests punishing Jimu, since this was yet another problem. Jenny explains that Chung Woo won by rolling on the ground, attacking from the sides, and even explains that using such moves was shameful. Suddenly the shaman master realizes that their fencing had a flaw, leaving the lower part of the body vulnerable, and the stance difficult to change. However, the first-class disciples didn't know this, and before realizing it, they would learn different martial arts to cover that weakness. But what the old man couldn't understand was how the protagonist knew that, since it wasn't something noticeable, unless you were actively looking for it. So his insight must be extremely sharp. Recalling the disciple of Myung-jin, the old man reflects that everyone knew how diligently he cared for his master, even when he thought it was the end. Yet he kept improving steadily. While the elder was marveling at Jimmy's actions, Jenny asks if he should summon him to punish him. But returning to the present moment, the elder asks if the merchants who were supposed to arrive that day had shown up yet, and the disciple replies that he was heading to Haejunji. After that, the old man walked off, saying that Jim had caught his interest now, and that he would make sure to take care of him upon seeing the shaman master's attitude. He thought he was useless and that Jin who should be put in his place. Trying to calm himself, he reflected that no matter what Jin who did, he was still from the streets, just a mere peasant, At the morning meeting on the day Jin who was punished, they had all decided not to send anyone to help him, except for the fool. So the idiot concluded that the most important thing at that moment was the merchants, because after Hyokian new gangs attacked, they had been weakened, and the neighboring estate's interest had shifted to the Zug clan, meaning they had no more sources of income. At that rate, it would be impossible to feed everyone, and accepting an alliance with the merchants was the only way out. He exclaimed that he was able to do it, thanks to his family's connections, since the old masters were too stupid to acknowledge his efforts. Guy walked off calling his disciples, reflecting that this would help him climb the ladder toward becoming a master. Disciple Jimmy complained about the sun, while Chung Woo remembered they were told someone would visit that day. The chubby one argued that everyone had spent the morning cleaning the place, and Chung Woo said Jin Yi would greet them later in the afternoon. But when they realized the visit was happening that afternoon, they went into complete shock. Suddenly they spotted a group of people approaching the area. Quickly they panicked to get rid of all the meat they had been eating. Observing the crowd, the protagonist noticed there were many people following Jinny as well. He reassured himself, saying getting rid of the evidence wouldn't take long, and that it all depended on Chung Woo and Sing Sang. What was most unbelievable was that they had stopped doing everything and gone to greet the arriving guest. Face to face with the visiting group, Sun asked if they were the merchants, and introduced himself as Chung Sun, a second-class disciple, saying he'd heard they were arriving that morning. He thanked them with a smile for coming from so far away. The idiot who was on his way met the merchants and greeted them. The merchants asked if something had happened with the shamans, which confused Jinny. Chung Woo said it was good to see his brother Jinny, but he didn't seem too happy about it. Casting a scornful look at Jin Woo, he suspected that the degenerate was eating meat again. The merchants had already started preparing the goods, so they could load them after that. Jinny led them safely to their destination, saying the mountain terrain was rugged. As they passed Jima, the idiot made a snide remark, telling them to watch their backs. The hero found it odd that the merchant was taking the lead, despite being an outsider, with Jinny following him as if it were normal, clearly indicating a difference in status. The protagonist asked his allies about the strangers, and Sun replied that they were merchants from Chongyang, managing a market for 3 generations. Jimmy remembered that in his previous body, he loved money and had learned the name of every market and merchant, so he found it strange since he didn't know them, considering they were already old, so he assumed they were nobodies. He also became suspicious of how that disciple was acting, treating a minor merchant like that, and concluded they were scheming something. Jimmy suspected the merchant was a swindler, noting his deceitful eyes and weak jawline, and decided to keep a close watch. He rushed over and told his people to follow him, warning them to wash their faces since they were covered in grease. Negotiating with the shaman master, the merchant said that to thank him, he brought a small gift. They were moved by such kindness, saying they had funding issues for so long, and that carrying finances had been hard. One of the shamans cried, saying he couldn't even provide uniforms for the apprentices. All he could do was tell them to be careful, which made him feel terrible for them. The shaman master said he couldn't express how grateful he was, but the merchant said he was the only one who should be thankful, that the shamans accepted his offer, and so the merchant revealed that it was all thanks to his connection with Mr. Jinny. The shaman master reflected that the idiot was a very influential figure from a good family, and had proudly become one of the leading disciples. The merchant said that if it weren't for Jinny, they wouldn't have found someone so important. Everyone was amazed at the idiot's actions, saying he had truly done something great. The shaman master exclaimed that he should give something in return, but had nothing that would be of use to the merchant. Yet the merchant comforted him, saying he expected nothing from the master. Then he adds that before leaving, he would like to visit the temple to pray for his family. The master reflects that the merchant seemed despicable at first glance, but up close he realized he was a good man. So the master judges himself, saying he had forgotten his manners by judging based on appearance. As the merchant was about to leave, the master invites him to stay a little longer, saying they had nothing to do. But the merchant, embarrassed, says that, as a stranger, he wasn't used to staying in a place like that. Insistently, the master says that no matter how uncomfortable he felt, he should feel free to watch the disciples train. After that, the merchant accepts the offer and says he'll stay outside. So the master tells him that someone will guide him soon. Alone in the room, the shamans breathe a sigh of relief, saying it was all incredible, and that the shamans might finally flourish again. Once again, the master thanks Jinny, saying he had done them a great favor. However, one of the shamans expresses concern, saying they didn't want anything in return, but eventually they were still merchants and would ask for an alliance, which meant they would have to help him. The reason for seeking out shamans was protection, since when you work as a merchant, you encounter many conflicts on your travels, and most merchants hire guards, but they're not very effective. In exchange for a donation, the shamans would help them, since having powerful allies like merchants was very important. The master remembers that, in the past, he had enough power to make merchants line up at their door, so he couldn't refuse the offer. After the Jush clan took a good portion of the shaman's territory, no one was interested in forming pacts with them anymore. So one of the shaman brothers says with authority that they couldn't let this opportunity slip away, and that they should show them how strong the shamans still were. He had the idea of putting on a small demonstration with the Chung's training, as people were always impressed by it. Quickly, Jenny says he's been practicing something with people under his command. That sparks the shaman's curiosity, making them excited to find out what he had prepared. Then he reveals gracefully that for a month, with the help of his master, he's been practicing the 9-headed attack. Upon hearing this, the shamans are thrilled, thinking that if he had trained, that there was nothing to worry about, and he was truly helping many shamans. Now he receives the order to prepare, since guests were waiting for him outside. The merchant's servants question whether that gift wasn't too much to give to the shamans. One servant argues that they gave boxes of silver, and could have taken something like that to the Jug clan, but the merchant quickly rebukes him, saying that for the Jug clan, that box of silver would mean nothing, because the Juga clan was very good with books and money, and they would know exactly what kind of people those merchants were. Most likely they wouldn't want to deal with money from smugglers, says the merchant while the merchant speaks. The hero is secretly listening from the rooftop, now fully aware of everything they were plotting. He confidently reflects that he had already claimed that place as his, and that the merchant wouldn't get anything from there. The merchant observes the disciples training amazed, saying they were impressive, arguing that even though they were second class, they still amazed him. The idiot reflects that having a merchant and a master watching his performance was exactly what he wanted most, but he couldn't stand the fact that the hero was also there beside him. One of the shamans had found Jimmy on the way, and said he wanted to see the 9-headed attack, and since it was his master's request, Jimmy couldn't refuse after that. The idiot's master says they had already seen enough, and tells him to start the 9-headed attack, so the disciple follows the order. Before Jinny begins the attack, Jimmy calls his attention, saying he's been looking forward to it, which makes the idiot furious, thinking he was being blatantly disrespected. Jinny was confident, thinking that, in front of Jimmy, no mistakes were allowed, and so he gives the command to begin the 9-headed attack. That attack was an honorable shaman technique, where 9 people form a line to eliminate the enemy. At first glance, it looks like they're moving in different directions, but by shifting back and forth, they trapped the enemy, because all 9 must work as a team, and they needed to put on a good display of skill. For the person in command, the hero watching comments that the formation was actually very interesting. Jenny's master asks if he was interested in her, and he replies that he was, but they needed to stay focused, which confuses the master, who asks why he thinks that. Jimmy explains that he wasn't sure, as he hadn't learned formations yet. Faced with this, he argues that after dispersing the attack, the next move should be to take down the enemy, but that formation was slightly off. He reveals that there was a lack of balance in all of it, and he advises that if the left flank attacks, it's better to retreat. Instead, they should slow down and move away, to strike from a better position. Still, Jimmy wasn't confident in his opinions, saying he needed to study more, but that certainly impressed the shaman, who said that he noticed all of that just by observing, and was able to identify the weakness in the formation, and think of ways to improve it. Deeply impressed by the protagonist, the shaman thought he was talented, but not that talented. and asked if it was the first time he was seeing the formation. Then Jinwoo awkwardly replied that he didn't know what he was talking about, and that they shouldn't be impressed. After seeing such a below-average performance, the merchant, overhearing the conversation, said that to him it seemed very impressive, and the shaman apologized, saying he had gotten concerned while a guest was nearby. Lightening the mood, the merchant said he was only asking what the two were talking about. The shaman exclaimed that the hero had just begun learning martial arts, and since he was very talented, there was a lot of hope in him. He added that even the master was interested in him, which caught the merchant's attention. Upon hearing that, the merchant reflected that maybe the one who could become a master disciple was the protagonist. The protagonist noticed the merchant was looking at him differently, which made him uncomfortable, but with conviction he thought he already knew everything about them. While Jimmy listened to the merchant's conversation, it was revealed that they knew giving silver to the Jug was a waste, but the shamans had no power and never did. However, the head merchant argued that even if they were weak, he saw them differently, because the shamans were the ones who lasted for thousands of years, as they were the most prideful. The merchant's plan was to make a pact with them, so that people would know they funded the shamans, and in doing so their reputation with others would also grow. The merchant revealed that they were being watched by other groups, so if a high-ranking shaman was present to assist, their image would be changed. Then the servant asked if the shamans would do what they wanted, once they found out what they were after. In the future, the merchant argued, that's exactly why they were putting on this whole show. He explained that the shamans had the master-disciple rank, which identified the disciple who would be the next master. But so far that decision hadn't been made yet. He said that Jinny was trying to become the next master-disciple, so he intended to use his family's connections, making promises to return the favors once he became master-disciple, without realizing their true plans. Since a merchant's goodwill always came at a high price, the merchant knew that the idiot was smart, but became foolish after becoming a shaman disciple. He believed Jinwoo would regret his decision. Once he realized what they were really doing now, Jinwoo assumed that the merchant believed he had invested in the wrong person. The hero harbored deep hatred for the fool, as he thought he could surpass him and become the master disciple. Jinwoo was fully confident he would learn his old arts to increase his power, and after becoming master disciple, master both styles once he had all the power in his hands. He would have the whole group under his control, and those in his way were just insects. He wanted to crush them to make his plans succeed. Jimmy reflected that to destroy Jinny's wicked plans, the merchant Gunju-san should gather every last detail about them, even down to the last hair. However, he had no way to leave that mountain of shamans, so he needed an excuse while they were eating. Jimmy's master noticed he seemed deep in thought, and asked what was on his mind. Jimmy tried to disguise his mood, while reflecting that he had gotten distracted for too long, and that there was no way for him to leave. Chubby Chong Wu whispered to the master that Jimmy had been like that ever since the Chunyang merchants visited, which made the master think that Jimmy was curious about the outside world after seeing The Outsiders, and that even though he was already an adult, he had never seen the world with his own eyes like his brothers had. The master reflects that all those years, he had been trapped on that mountain, carrying out his duties after that. The master asks Jinwoo what day it would be the next day, and he's answered with a waxing crescent, which makes him happy. That makes Jinwoo suspicious, wondering why the master was smiling like an idiot when there were so many things to worry about. 2 days later, the master calls Jinwoo to his room and surprises him by wearing his dopa robe. It is then revealed that he's going to the Jeso Palace, but Jinwoo warns him that the wind was very cold, and he would probably get sick again, and then Jinwoo would have to do all the chores. But the master doesn't listen, saying he was wearing warm clothes, and immediately says they should leave. Jinwoo notices that the master had been smiling like a lunatic since yesterday. The clan, the shamans, was holding an elders conference, where the host of the clan was present. They were planning the events of the upcoming month, discussing expenses, debating about the apprentices, and more. At that conference, not only the masters were present, but also their first disciples were attending. Jinwoo reflects that Myeongjin was always at the palace, and had never seen anything beyond the darkness, so he assumed he had never attended this kind of event. As they were entering the location, their old acquaintance Jin Hyo meets them, and the master moves to greet him, Jin Hyo says he should have visited the master more often, but the master exclaims that it was fine, and asks if he had made progress finding a good apprentice. With a spontaneous smile, Jin Hyo reveals that with the master's help, he was able to see the world through different eyes. Trying to make small talk with Jin Mu, he says he had an amazing sage, but Jin Woo wondered why he looked so cheerful, after nearly beating him to death. After all that, they proceeded toward the entrance and Jin Hyo began accompanying them. As they entered the venue, the master was greeted by many people who knew him. Jinmu was shocked by how many people treated him with such politeness and admiration, and suddenly, the master of the shamans finds them, asking what they were doing there. He asks Myung-jin if he should even be there, and if he was well enough to walk. Then Myung-jin reveals that he had recently recovered enough to walk freely with the help of his disciple. The master reflects on the fact that Meat helped Myung-jin and concludes that he should have lifted that ban long ago. He praises Jinmu, saying he did well, and invites them to come inside since it was very cold outside. Jinmu was extremely shocked by that response, wondering if it was some kind of greeting competition. While Jin Hyo asks if he's proud of his master, he reveals that Myung-jin was the most respected elder in the clan, because before losing his abilities alongside the current clan master, he had once been a candidate to lead the clan. Moreover, when the Saw clan attacked, Myung-jin was the only one still standing, fighting to protect his disciples. He represented the clan's ideology and was an icon. So Jin Hyo exclaims, there was no way not to respect him because of his achievements. But to Jinmu, he was just a bastard who once tried to fight him, and now that he couldn't do anything, he was even more useless inside. The shaman's meeting was taking place, but Jinmu was trembling from how boring it all was. He reflects that after the clan suffered from poverty and got their hands on some money, all the palaces started requesting things, and the conference was getting longer and longer. Jin states that building ties with the commercial center could be beneficial, but they should still consider the consequences. He argues that Jin Hyo's recommendation was good, but the merchants' motives were unclear, and they didn't know the source of their income, and those questions could cause problems. Hearing that, Jinny feels a chill down his spine, wondering what that old man who wasn't even active anymore was saying after that. Myung-jin proposes placing disciples alongside the merchants to help investigate more closely. He adds that there was a tradition with the old commercial centers, where disciples were sent to protect them, and the disciples they had were stronger than any guards the merchants had, so they would appreciate the help. The master agrees with the idea and wonders who they should send. It had to be one of the first-class disciples and the right one. Immediately Myung-jin suggests his disciple Jinmu, saying there was nothing to worry about. Jinmu is extremely surprised, reflecting that keeping his master alive had finally paid off, and that he took back everything he had said about him being useless. Jin Hyo argued that the concern was valid, and that the other first-class disciples were already busy with other issues, so it was better to send Jinmu. This surprised Jinmu even more, realizing that Jinho was actually a good guy and that if he had known, he wouldn't have beaten him nearly to death. Jinhee's master also agreed, since Jinmu had already met the merchant leader, who also seemed very interested. After that, everyone agreed with the decision, aligning Jinmu's fate once again, as the problem he had been facing ended up solving itself. The shaman master went on to say that even with all the difficulties, they should do their best in the mission, and that Jinmu should return to Changyong and prepare for the journey. Jinmu celebrated his victory like a madman, saying that a well-educated master in youth was better than 10 clans together. But the jerk wasn't happy at all with the outcome, thinking Jinmu was trying to ruin all the hard work he had put into that plan. On a rainy day, Jenny complained to Cyan, asking if he was just going to stand there watching everything happen, which made Cyan reflect. The fool exclaimed that Jenny was still serving a sentence for breaking the rules, and having him out on a mission was madness. One of the disciples, named Jinso, argued that he had every right to be angry, but forgiveness had already been granted to the hero by the elders. Still stubborn, Jenny said the conference decisions weren't always right, and even the elders could be wrong. Jinsu told him to shut up, but the bastard insisted he wasn't wrong. He went on saying that each first-class disciple had already been chosen in each palace, all from noble families, and all were competing for the same position. On the other hand, The hero was just the son of a peasant with mansion being all he had, and even so he influenced the master's judgment, receiving other apprentices even more enraged. The jerk said that Jimmy broke all shamanic traditions, and should be punished for his actions. Suddenly Jin Hyo appeared, saying Jimmy was being scandalous for the wrong reason. He questioned what the traditions had brought so far, but arrogantly Jenny replied that, after getting beaten by Jimmy, Jin Hyo had a lot to say. Jin Hyo approached confidently and said right in the bastard's face that all he saw was envy. Jin Hyo argued that Myung Jin, after eating meat, could walk freely around, and besides, the meat ban had already been lifted, and Myung Gong also agreed to send him. Jinny was frustrated, because Jin Hyo always meddled where he wasn't called. Jin Hyo retorted saying he had successfully connected the commercial center with the shamans, even without asking permission from the Jinggong Palace, which should have caused some annoyance. It said that connecting and communicating with external influences was the job of the Jinggong Palace, and so he should have informed them before approaching Mr. Mengchong. But instead he went straight to speak with the clan master. With all the authority, Jin Hyo said he should know his place, because the disciple master represents the shamans. He couldn't just use the title for his family's benefit. Outraged, Jin Hyo drew his sword, saying he shouldn't dare do such a thing. Jing Dang intervened in the fight and ordered them to stop, as they were leaders of a palace and shouldn't cause chaos. He argued in a hostile tone that no one could question the decision made in the elders' conference. After that he walked away and Jin Hyo ran after him. One of the people present asked Jin Hyo to calm down, knowing he hated when people talked about his family. But Jin Hyo knew the other guy was wrong, and even the officials had already dropped the subject. Suddenly the guy asked if Jimmy was really that handsome. Confused, Jin Hyo stared at him. The guy then explained that from his expression when talking about the hero, it looked like he was in love. Jin Hyo said he was so handsome he could kill, and that his martial arts skills were on another level. Cyan commented that even though the protagonist wasn't a woman, he still managed to steal his heart, so it must have been shocking. Cyan lamented since Chung Sang had also gone to Chung Hyam, and had no intention of returning. Unfortunately everyone liked Jimu. However, Jin Hyo said that Chung Sang hadn't had an easy life, and could only blame Sa Kyung for that. He was a child who couldn't overcome his inner hatred, and for that reason he wasn't accepted into the Yongdong Palace, whose role was to deal with life and death. Jin Hyo supposed that now things were okay, and that Jimmy seemed like a promising beginner, and that's how he would become worthy of the title of Disciple Master. Sahan had doubts about the protagonist becoming Disciple Master, but noted that the others in Jin Hyo agreed. However, that would never happen without the permission of Sae Hyang, Jinggong and Jin Hyo. Jin Hyo then recites a proverb: sharp tips will always find a way to pierce the bag, meaning the protagonist would show his worth in any situation. With that said, Sae Hyang states that he couldn't keep arguing with him. Everyone was eager to see what the MC would be able to do. Outside the palace under heavy rain, Kimu and his master were walking, commenting that when they left, it was morning and now it was already night. The hero looked at his master with a goofy smile, and was asked why he was staring at him like that. The hero was very proud of his master because even while sick, he got up and came all the way there. But he replied it was just because he was getting stronger. He asked if the MC wasn't curious about exploring the world, and told him not to worry, just to have fun. The protagonist replied that if he felt bad, he'd eat meat or even drink alcohol. The master said there was no problem with that, and confessed he had tried some when he was young. Reflecting, the protagonist joked that maybe not even the women would leave him alone, but quickly added it was just a joke. Suddenly the two disciples of the hero appeared, asking where they were going, and if it was an outside the village mission, because they wanted to go along to take care of the master. Jimmy was shocked to be called master, while they argued that they already had Mr. Joe's permission, and even got borrowed money to ensure their safe return. The MC, however, said he wasn't crazy enough to take them with him, and that he would choose the right people. They should back off. The two disciples didn't accept it and ran after their master. From afar, Ginny watched, thinking that Jimmy wouldn't ruin her family's efforts. 20 years ago, the idiot's grandfather sent him to become a shaman disciple. He said the fate of the Wu family was in Ginny's hands. The family needed to gain recognition as a true martial arts clan. Before the grandfather, they had always been on the outskirts, a group that did dirty work, For those who didn't want to get their hands dirty, the grandfather managed to steer the clan toward martial arts, but they were still not officially recognized. Despite all the training, the fool still had managed to become the 7th shaman. Jenny had one goal: to become a master disciple and lead her clan. But Jim, who was about to ruin everything, even without being able to stop him directly, she saw there an opportunity. He stated that during an external mission, many unexpected dangers could occur, and according to the shaman commandments, there was one rule that must never be broken under any circumstance: the murder of a student releasing a bird into the air. The fool concluded that Jimmy wasn't the only one who could break the commandments. It is said that when a shaming disciple goes on a journey, he should first visit each palace to ask the elders for permission. While the hero's disciples were excited to go with him, Jimmy just grumbled that the palaces were too far apart, and that there were dozens of mountains between them. At the first palace, one white one, they gave him old clothes that had been refurbished to look new, and Jinho, who was there, said he was very happy he was going on his first mission. At the second palace, Yenjin, they gave him advice and explained all the rules he must follow while traveling the world. After that, he heard about things that must be checked and coordinated, and he also received a new sword with a clear pattern, along with the general list: golden spear, medicine, and bandages. Jimmy was finally able to stop at Jason Palace to request the master's permission to leave, as these were shaman traditions and the disciple had to follow them. The protagonist only wished they would simplify the process, because he was already exhausted and hadn't even left the village yet. The master asked if Chung Wu and Chung Sang would go with him, and he confirmed they would. The master said they were smart and would be very useful, but Jimmy deep down knew they weren't smart. They just had no choice but to go with him, since no one else volunteered. The master gave his final advice, telling him not to let the water run out, and not to go anywhere suspicious. However, the MC had more experience in the world than that old man, who had been confined to that mountain forever. The master mentioned the most important part of the mission, that he must do everything he could not to tarnish the name of the shamans, and after that, permission to leave the village was finally granted. Then Jimmy ran out happily, saying he would return, but before he could leave the room, the master called him again and asked him to make sure to contact him once a day. The hero agreed formally, but deep down he found it all frightening. After all that, he reflects that just going through the procedure to leave the village was already exhausting. As they walked out of the village, Jimmy sighed and said he loved all of it. To him, even the air felt different, and he noticed it the moment he stepped out of the shaman's domain. Then he called his disciple's attention, intending to say something. The protagonist tossed his sword to Chung Sang and his bag to Chung Wu, telling him to hold on to them. Chung Sang felt uneasy, and said that swords should be carried by their owner, as a sword was like a swordsman's life. To shut Chung Sang up, Jim asked if he wanted to be sent back. However, the pretty boy complied, and said he would take care of the sword as if it were his life. The MC states that the distance from the entrance of Mutong Mountain to the top of Qianyang was a bit over 100, so it would take them a day on horseback. Now they were even more excited to head toward Qianyang's commercial center. That was how their journey began, but it wasn't going the way Jim expected. Just a few steps ahead, they encountered a gang of bandits, telling them to hand over everything they had. The hero reflects that the world had changed fast, but robbing people right in front of shaman territory was insane. Chung Sang stepped forward and asked who they were, affirming that they had surely heard of the shaman's strength, so they shouldn't dare block their path. Still taunting the bandits, the long-haired one said that nothing good would happen if they went through with this, so they should stop being idiots. The bandits ignored him, saying that the clan was going bankrupt and didn't scare anyone. They again demanded they hand over everything. Ready to attack again, they added that if they had money, they should hand that over too. Watching it all, Jim thought the bandits' behavior was so cliché it made him sleepy, even though they were trying. The MC then said they should clean up that mess, since they needed to arrive before sunset at their destination. Chung Sang once again stepped forward and told them to give up, so no one would get hurt. Getting no answer, the bandits charged in to attack directly. They all launched coordinated attacks against the handsome one, but none of it worked. The pretty boy managed to strike two of them with his weapon, leaving them helpless. The other two who were observing charged at him furiously, but Chung Sang blocked the attack with ease. While Jimmy watched the whole fight, he reflected that most of them had nothing special, but 2 of them had good moves. Those were likely the leaders. Their strategy was to let their subordinates go first and hide behind until an opportunity appeared. The hero found it amusing and noted that Chung Sang was channeling his chi through the sword, and after receiving his tips, he had gotten even stronger. So even if all of them fought together, the pretty boy could defeat them. But suddenly one of the bandits attacked the long-haired one, directly causing his weapon to fly off. The protagonist says that Chung Sang's skills could have allowed him to lead a small village. Jimmy was fully confident that they wouldn't lose to mere bandits. Meanwhile, Chung Handsome was being attacked from all sides, but the MC recalls that the pretty boy had no real combat experience. He says that unlike training, where everything is rehearsed, a real fight has unexpected movements, and the only thing that exists in a real fight is violence and cruelty. He concludes that a Marian practitioner, who spent his whole life in mountains, like Chung Sang, would be very surprised by his first real battle. Because of that, confusion often leads to absurd mistakes. Sometimes you end up being defeated by a weaker opponent. With Chung Handsome about to lose his head to one of the bandit strikes, taking a direct hit, Chung Sang knew it was too late to dodge. But suddenly Jim appeared in front of him, stopping the sword with both hands, saying he let him fight to gain some experience. Then he broke the sword, barehanded, and kicked the bandit away with a single blow. And afterward he finished with a 2-fist punch, right to the back of the thug's neck, causing massive damage and knocking him out on the spot. The protagonist pointed at one of the bandits and said he could tell the guy had a lot of experience with swords, and then asked why someone like him was hanging out with weaklings, like those with his expertise. The hero guessed he had some kind of contract with someone. Without saying a word, the bandit threw kunai at Jimmy and ran off at full speed, but the kunai had little effect on the MC, who deflected them with his bare hands. As the bandit fled, he reflected that his opponent was much stronger than expected, and had already figured everything out. But before he could do anything, he was caught by Jimmy, who subdued him and pinned his head to the ground, saying he didn't have permission to run away. After immobilizing him, Jimmy said they were going to have a little chat, and began by asking who they were looking for and who had sent them. The bandit, full of confidence, said the hero was an idiot and that he wouldn't say anything, which surprised Jimmy. So he started by saying that just because he was a dousher didn't mean he would let him go. With just a warning, MC began applying pressure to the bandit's arm until he broke his shoulder. After that, he twisted the bandit's ankle, saying that in a fight for survival, one should be ready to face anything. Then Jimmy broke the bandit's knee, stating that this kind of thing was normal in their line of work. The beaten bandit called the MC cruel, but the hero said it was funny, since he was the one who tried to kill him first. But after growing tired of the bandit and calling him useless, the hero moved on to question someone else. The bandit began to make sudden movements, so the protagonist warned that if he moved, he might accidentally break his neck. And so Jimmy began torturing him. While the other bandits watched the scene, they were horrified by that dousher, as he was unlike anyone they had ever seen. After beating the bandit, the MC said he was upset that his uniform was now covered in blood. Now Jimmy wondered who he would question next, while the bandits already knew that if they got caught, they might be crippled or worse, killed. So they all lined up to tell the protagonist everything. Now fully informed, the hero knew his mission was to capture 3 young Daoshin. The guys Jimmy had beaten up and who had fainted were Sipayan Yong, known in the back alleys of his village, and they thought it was just a job to capture 3 kids. Now the MC was sure there were spies among them. He didn't understand why they dared to attack a clan that was still strong when even the big shots wouldn't dare provoke. Given that, Jimmy assumed they had agreed on a generous sum of money to carry out this contract, but he still wondered who would spend so much money to capture 3 Daoshin, and for what purpose. So he asked the bandits who was behind all of it. But judging by their faces, it was clear they really didn't know anything. So Jinmu knew he'd have to speak directly to boss Pao Liang. The hero asked if the bandits were well known in the alleys, and they replied that yes. One of them had killed the famous martial artist and hid in Danjingu. After that, the MC asked how much they were going to get paid for this job. It was revealed they would only get around 10 silvers. Protagonist said that was way too cheap, clearly disappointed, and on top of that, The MC asked if they had anything with them, which confused them after handing over all the money they had. He told them they were free to go. Jimmy's disciples were horrified to see their master robbing the bandits. The hero warned the bandits not to babble about what had happened there to Paurian, because if he got there and didn't find Paurian, they would all be in trouble, dramatically smashing a coin in his hand. All the bandits panicked and quickly promised not to worry, that they would run away and become good people, and never hurt anyone again. But the protagonist didn't care, saying they didn't need to do that and could keep living in the alleys. He added that they could keep robbing and making others miserable, because people should live how they were born. Tired of it all, the hero tossed a coin at their heads, and they said they had learned their lesson and would leave, swearing on their father's name. The hero grew more furious, telling them to do whatever they wanted, just to get out of there and stop annoying him. So the bandits quickly fled, begging for forgiveness while the disciples watched, reflecting that even though they were bad, Jim had beaten them brutally and still robbed them. That wasn't something a Dowsher should do, but the protagonist just walked away calmly, telling his disciples to carry the two bandits who were left behind, because they were heading down the mountain. There they were at the entrance of the Gangu, home of Banshee and Kawanan, while the others carried the wounded. Jimmy said he would go speak to Kawanan, and told his disciples to wait outside. After the MC turned his back on them, they collapsed on the ground from exhaustion, saying they hadn't had a single moment of rest during the entire journey. Chung Wu commented to his brother that he found the master's behavior strange, saying he knew he was cruel, but the way he acted with the bandits was surreal. But Chung Sang revealed that he admired how the master handled the situation, because the people they encountered earlier were bandits, who made others miserable, and he argued that they could easily do something bad again, but the expression they had when they fled suggested they would never return. Chung Sang shared that he lost his family to bandits who were brutally murdered along with the villagers for no reason, and if it hadn't been for Master Minghua, who happened to be in the area, he wouldn't be alive today. And when the master handed the bandits over to the guards, it was revealed that the guards had been bribed, meaning that to this day those bandits were still looting villages. With hatred in his eyes, Chung Sang said he would never forgive them, and that one day he intended to kill them with his own hands. That was the reason he learned to wield the sword. Elders Jinso and Manhwa kept telling Chung Sang to forgive them and find his inner peace. However, upon meeting Master Jin Mu, Chung Sang came to understand the meaning of a true guide. His role is to enlighten and guide others. Jin Mu punished the bandits for targeting innocent lives, and planted the idea in their heads that, if they ever committed crimes again, they would be found and punished. And Chung Sang looked at Jin Mu as someone walking through hell, yet still bringing light to the world. Now Chung Sang was determined to walk the difficult path of enlightening the wicked, and he would follow any order from his master. Inside the estate, Jinmu was shouting at Quan, demanding a higher reward for the bandits, claiming that children had been hurt with cuts in their clothes. He was trying to bargain for just one more nong, but the owner just said he was a very greedy Dowsher, and the reward was only 10 nongs. The owner argued that one of them wasn't even recognizable, because his face was so smashed. So Jinmu asked if he was implying that Dowsher was lying. After the owner begged to be released, he said it was the first time in his life he'd seen a Dowsher like Jinmu, and then handed over one more coin. But before leaving, Jinmu asked if he knew someone named Li Pelayan. He said he did, but that guy slipped away like a gnu. And before anything else, Jinmu asked how much he was worth, but the owner didn't understand. Then Jinmu asked if there was a bounty on his head. It was revealed that Li Palyong had a bounty of 20 nings, which excited Jinmu. Jinmu said this guy must really be a rotten and wicked man, and although he himself was probably just a hard worker, he needed the money to survive. The owner asked if Jinmu was sure he wanted to go after him, and Jinmu confirmed it then. The owner explained that they had tried to catch him several times, but he was excellent in martial arts, and they didn't have the strength to track him. However, Jinmu was deeply skeptical about that claim, that this guy was good at martial arts. It said that Danjingu is the kingdom of the Jiggle family, and Sapishin could only expand its territory by picking fights. Since the Jiggle family was already well established, there naturally wouldn't be many strong martial artists, just a few scattered ones. And those few decent martial artists who remained were hiding out in gambling dens, black markets, or even the light district, so it was impossible not to be able to track them. Jinmu was eager to find Palagon, because he wanted to question him and also wanted some extra income. When he reunited with his disciples, they jumped into his arms crying, saying they admired him and would follow him forever. Jinmu reflected that they had carried luggage and walked for 2 hours, so they must have gone insane from hunger and exhaustion. So Jinma suggested they go eat, making Chinangu's eyes shine with hope. Jinmu said the day was special, because it was their first day outside the village, so they would eat some well-cooked meat. And there they were, at a restaurant surrounded by mountains in all 4 directions. He Wooljek ordering loads of meat and bottles of alcohol. As they were being served, Jinmu told his disciples to eat as much as they wanted. Because it was unlimited, the 2 devoured all the food, saying it was great to have a restaurant that offered unlimited meat, and that everything was truly delicious. The people present at the restaurant observed the behavior of the Daoshins, eating meat and drinking alcohol, and said they were going crazy. Bandits from a distance were watching the protagonist's table, saying they recognized those guys. They said it was a good idea to stop by the restaurant to check the news, and after that, they would look for Paliang and tell him what had happened. The 2 left the restaurant saying they were going to meet Jiang Ju. People who saw the bandits leaving remarked that they looked familiar, identifying one as a Zhou Bang from Wugajang, and they were interested in finding out their motives for visiting Bang Qian. But one of them said it didn't matter anymore, as he didn't care about what Wu Gejang was doing, the reason being that they were only there to inspect the Bangchong Yin kingdom. The second son of the Jigel family noticed the presence of the Daoshers in the restaurant, and commented that it had been a while since any had come by. A guard exclaimed that there had been a recent incident, and they had been expelled from the Gupta Center and went into hiding. But they were stunned to see the shamans eating meat and even drinking. The city of Dangongu was centered around Yangchong Mountain, spreading its roots into the 5 main places:
Dangangu Yang,
Aichang Muhan and Yang Jianshan. The Jigel family held great prestige in martial arts, and in Dangon alone, there were more than 100 people with the Jigel surname, affiliated with warriors, merchants, laborers, and so on. Naturally, the direct descendant of the Jagal family and second son of the province had authority, although in Dangangu it was hard to put his authority into words. Second son observed the protagonist group, assuming they were in their 20s and enjoying the food quite a lot. His guard commented that if those were their disciples, it was easy to assume they'd reached the top ranks, since the shamans were a declining clan. But the second son disagreed, saying that even if a tiger hides in the mountains, it's still a tiger, and when it leaves, it's to hunt for food. The second son was interested in knowing if the protagonists were just cubs, or full-grown tigers. If they were around 20 years old, they would be at the area of Sword Realm. He spoke directly to his guard, who had already reached the Vertigo Realm, instructing him to test them without overdoing it. The guard accepted the order, saying he would only pressure them a bit, just enough to suppress them. Standing before them, the guard addressed Jimu, asking what they were doing in a place like that. Then he introduced himself as Bonghu of Jigel, saying he had always admired the shamans, and claimed it was fate that had brought them together. He then offered to buy a drink for everyone at the table, but the MC quickly turned hostile, saying he was full of crap, and added that it was obvious from just one look what he was trying to do. Jimmy stared him down and dared him to try that again, causing the guard to panic and question what kind of Vauxhall he was. Watching Jimmy's behavior, he thought that he acted and spoke worse than a bandit. It was as if a bandit had stolen Adashi's uniform. Then the hero said that too many scumbags in the restaurant were annoying him. He pointed out that some despicable people were gossiping about them, eating, and had been staring at them for a long time, and the protagonist added that those men were the ones irritating him the most, pointing directly at the second son. He said that if he wanted to verify something, he should do it himself instead of sending his dog. Being called a dog enraged the guard, but Jimmy quickly diffused the situation. Then the hero called Chung Lindo, and revealed that this person was curious about their skills. He added that if he acted like a coward again, he would be killed. However, Chung Sang told him not to worry, and stood ready in a fighting stance against the guard. The guard was unsure, thinking the plan wasn't going as expected, and wondering if it was okay to fight like that. The second son reflected that they had taken the initiative, but thanks to that it would now be easier to test their skills and get straight to the point. Thinking about Jima, the second son noted that besides eating meat and drinking alcohol, he had the attitude of a bandit. That made him unique, unlike anyone he had ever seen, and he compared him to a confident wolf pup, but still wondered if he had the skill to match. Ready for the duel, the guard said they had filthy mouths to talk big, but since it had come to this, he hoped their skills were as sharp as their tongues. Jimmy asked what he was doing. Seeing that Chung Sang was using only one sword, the guard fell into complete confusion. Unable to understand what kind of bastards they were, he realized he was fighting a second-generation disciple, and stated that he was one of the best martial artists from the Jiggle family, but he refused to draw his sword to deal with a second-generation disciple, saying his Jux Gong 1 was enough. While watching, Jimmy said he would regret that, because as long as he underestimated Chung Sang, he wouldn't see his full strength. That arrogance would create openings, and if the pretty boy didn't miss them, he would win. And so the duel began, with Chung Handsome charging straight in with the flowing cloud sword technique, aiming for the guard's face, which he easily dodged. The protagonist observed that Chung Sang's technique wasn't like a flowing cloud, it was more like lightning. The long-haired one kept pressuring the opponent with his attacks, but the guard kept dodging until he took a kick to the back. The guard was convinced, now reflecting, that the first strike was actually interesting, but he still considered him a complete amateur. While pressuring Chung Handsome, he said his weakness was in the hand, holding the sword and the lower defense of his body. Dodging another attack, the guard sighed, saying he had great skills for a second-generation disciple, but it was time to finish this. The hero also realized that Chung Shang's weakness was in his lower body, a flaw from his cloud sword technique. Then the protagonist noticed that the pretty boy was intentionally exposing his weaknesses in this battle, and so he wondered when he'd gotten that clever. The guard Bang, who acted confidently knowing his opponent had a weak lower defense, he was certain that he was still just an amateur, and thus went in for the attack. Chung Sang tried to hold off the strikes, but ended up getting kicked and thrown backward. But just as Bang, who was about to finish him with a punch to the face, the pretty boy dodged and rushed toward the guard, exposing his front. That's when Bang, who realized that all along he was the one who had fallen into a trap, and he took a clean hit to the chin, thrown far and crashing into a table. He was still being relentlessly pressured by Chung Handsome and his sword, and that's when the brutal beating from Chung Sang began. Jimmy was proud watching it, saying it was music to his ears, and that it had been worth teaching that disciple. He was doing it right. The second boss, who had been watching, screamed at Bengahu, calling it shameful to fight children like that, saying he was a useless man. Hearing those words, Bengahu stood up with a tremendous aura and flung the pretty boy's sword sheath far away. The air had shifted and Bengahu was furious with his opponent, releasing his sword technique. Jimmy noted that Bengahu's technique was like a snake's tongue, a skill exclusive to first-class martial artists. Jimmy exclaimed that Chung Sang had been close to winning, but he should have broken at least one arm or a leg when he had the chance. But just as Jimmy was about to step in to help the pretty boy, he noticed that the young man looked even more determined, using the sword of loyalty. While the chubby one squirmed and begged the master to help Chung Handsome, he simply told him to shut up and chose to give Chung Sang a chance. Benga, who upon seeing Chung Sang's techniques, said that he was very good compared to other young people, but that technique wouldn't stand up to his key sword, whose concentration was unmatched. He added that the most important thing about a key sword was that it allowed you to attack someone from a long distance, creating an unimaginable gap. And there was Bang, who lashing out with his sword toward the pretty boy, applying pressure. Chung Sang tried to put some distance between himself and his opponent, but Bang, who kept up the attacks, saying he couldn't escape. The long-haired one made risky moves, jumping off a wall straight at his opponent and attacking head-on, but before he could reach him, he was struck by the key sword and thrown back. Jinmu, watching his movements, felt proud of Chung Sang, as he kept trying to close the distance with Bandahu, while looking for a gap to exploit his weakness. The pretty boy had already noticed the difference between them, but his eyes were still burning with resolve for the fight. Seeing all this, the MC finally understood that he wasn't his disciple yet, but he would train him, so that he wouldn't embarrass him in front of others. While they traveled, and so Jimmy was suddenly stopped Bangahu's attack, asking if all he was going to do was keep drawing his sword, and since he was good he wanted to play with him a little, drawing his sword and saying not to be mean to his kids. Bangahu was furious for having his fight interrupted, and suddenly, Chung Sang shouted for his master to let him fight a little longer. Everyone was impressed to learn that the protagonist was that young man's master, so they assumed that Jimmy must be a Jinjabi, a first-generation disciple of the shamans, those who were considered the main source of strength in the clan. While Chung Lindo insisted he could still fight for his master, he thought to himself that he had disappointed him again with his skills and couldn't become his disciple like that. But to Chung Sang's surprise, the hero praised him, saying he had done very well and that from now on, he would teach him how to defeat delinquents like that. Chung Sang was amazed and curious to see the senior demonstrate his martial arts, since the last duel of the senior against Jin Hyo had only been retold by the chubby one, and he hadn't witnessed it, and the other fight against the bandits of Taepyeongyang was just a one-sided beating, so he was extremely curious to see if the senior would use his key sword. Ganga, who laughed out loud when he heard that Jimmy thought he could beat him, he understood his confidence after becoming a first-generation disciple. But in the end he was just underestimating his opponent far too much. But Jimmy lashed out, saying he was just a mediocre guy cleaning up the mess left by a baby, and added that he was scared. Hearing Jimmy's words, Bang Ahan became completely enraged and his entire aura changed. Jimmy's disciples noticed the shift in atmosphere, saying they felt chills, and wondered what their master wanted to make him that angry. Watching everything unfold, Jimmy said that Han Jieho should know his place when releasing such violent ki, that he was actually enjoying all of it. The second-in-command, watching from the side, was trembling with fear, saying things were getting dangerous and that, if it continued, it would turn into a battle to the death, leading to conflict between clans. What he feared most was a war between the shamans and the jiggles, because even weakened, the shamans were still one of the strongest clans, even though the second-in-command wanted to end the fight. It continued. Bengahim said he was fed up with that arrogant Dao Shi, and that he would show him the difference in their strength, launching a direct strike with the sacred sword of Sokien. Jim's disciples panicked, saying the Keto sword was extremely powerful, and that Jimmy should be careful. However, Jimmy remained calm and simply said they should watch and learn. He dodged the strike, saying that it wasn't all about strength, but how he used it. He then stopped his opponent's sword, using only the sword of loyalty, redirecting the full force of the attack to the ceiling. Meng Han became even more enraged, shouting for him to stop belittling him and attacking again with his key sword. But once more, Jimmy redirected the attacks with perfect precision. Sung Chong was in awe of his master's technique. He realized he was using the edge of the sword to reflect the attacks, which made the difference between a key sword and the sword of loyalty nearly meaningless. That's when he understood the true way to use the sword of loyalty. Meanwhile, Jimmy advanced swiftly toward his opponent and landed a strike on his face, and then another on his shoulder, slamming him to the ground. Having subdued him, Bunga Hand dropped to his knees as Jimmy grabbed his hair from behind, saying that this was how it should be and how he should be. Looking at him, then began beating him as usual. The second son, watching all of it, just thought Bunga Han was a complete idiot. While his servants asked what they were supposed to do now, suddenly he leaped from where he was and headed straight for Jimu, preparing to use the Jiggle clan's technique. Juno's blood claw, he aimed for Jimu's fist, but Jimu quickly appeared behind him, asking what he was trying to do. Mocking him, Jimmy said he was just a scholar who didn't understand martial arts, which made him immediately furious. Said that the Jiggle clan is known for having some of the greatest academic knowledge, but little is said about their well-developed martial skills, so all those rumors were misinformed. Jimu, knowing this, entertained himself by throwing insults at his opponent, trying to provoke him. The second son took the bait, completely becoming consumed by his rage, saying that Jimu had crossed the line, and that he would no longer hold back. Now he charged in for the attack, saying he would regret mocking the Jiggle clan. Meanwhile, Jimmy was ready for the fight, saying he shouldn't just stand there talking. Guru was injured and the second son's subordinates were watching him, so he concluded there was no way he could be humiliated any further. He decided to attack with all his strength, aiming to at least take the protagonist's wrist with him. Jimmy found all of it hilarious, so he began his technique, Taishang Sansu. He started deflecting all of his opponent's blows with ease, and before long he grabbed the second son's wrist and punched him in the face with full force. The second son panicked, not understanding how this could happen, as his blood claw was among the top 3 techniques in his jiggle family, but it had no effect on the hero. Seeing that all his attempts had failed, he gave up on the blood claw and focused solely on punching Jimmy's arrogant face. Now he was determined to amplify his ki and pour everything into his right hand. He charged in a straight line without fear, ready to land his final blow. The protagonist didn't flinch, and also advance using only his right hand. After that, a huge explosion erupted at the site. A lot of smoke grows from the impact, leaving Jim's disciples confused about their master's condition. And to no one's surprise, the hero had defeated the second son. His subordinates were worried about his condition, but the second son knew he had never stood a chance. Jimmy approached him and said he had come prepared in case the fight turned bloody. Before anything else, the second son asked for his opponent's name and questioned whether he was from the first generation, assuming he might be using Ginger Bear. The second son insisted on knowing the name of his opponent, so since the hero knew he was so curious, he said he would tell him so he could carve it into his memory. His name would echo from the peak of Yongman. The second son walked away with his subordinates, his pride wounded, saying they would meet again. The protagonist stopped them, saying they couldn't leave just yet. He pointed out that everything around them was destroyed, which meant the jiggle disciple had caused massive damage to the property of an innocent civilian. The jiggle disciple argued that his family would make contact, so he didn't need to worry. After that, Jim, being cheeky, said that he had also caused them damage while they were eating, and demanded he pay their food and drink bill. He claimed that since the disciple was probably very rich, it shouldn't be a problem. The second son knew the protagonist was trying to swindle him, but no longer had the patience to argue. So he just tossed a bag of coins and walked off. The protagonist, even more shameless, asked if he didn't have any more gold, suggesting he was poorer than he looked. But the second son was done talking and said he was leaving. Once again the hero interrupted him, telling him to take his mustached guard, who was still unconscious, with him, but he refused, saying he didn't need failures, and finally left the place with his servants. Jim knew he was a disrespectful scumbag, but he had surpassed his expectations. After all, he lost to him, and he was much worse than the MC Ganjali walking through the streets, vomited blood due to the intense fight. His subordinates tried to help him, but he refused, telling them not to touch him. He remembered that the moment he was exposed to the protagonist's aura field, his intestines were severely injured, but at least he hadn't vomited in front of him. He had been deceived, thinking Jimmy was just a wolf cub, when in fact he was a true tiger son with very sharp claws, and he knew the only reason the hero was there, having come down from the mountain, was the Dang Dang market. And if that market were to return to their hands, it would cause unimaginable damage to his family. After that, Gonzalez ordered someone to be hired to secretly follow Jimmy and report back on where he was staying. He wanted every detail. He feared the shamans might be planning another storm, but nothing would go according to their plans. Now the main group was in the center of the Danganga village. The chubby one was amazed by all the delicious food passing by, and Jin Woo compared him to a frog that had just climbed out of a well. However, the MC was concerned that their clothing was drawing too much attention. He had already gotten used to the clothes, but after so many fights, they were worn out and he didn't have any spares. He was proud of having taken money from the Jiggles, because if not for that he would have been in deep trouble, and he knew he had to spend little on clothes. Nevertheless, they headed to the clothing store to do some business. When the vendor realized the main group was already touching his clothes, he panicked, shouting at them not to touch the clothes with their filthy hands. He exclaimed that the douches looked like beggars, but upon seeing Jimmy shaking his coin pouch, his eyes filled with interest. He knew that pouch held many silver coins, and that sound was definitely the heavenly chime of silver. The vendor approached the hero with utmost courtesy, saying it was an honor to have him there, and Jimmy asked if he had silk to make a dopo. The vendor presented the shop, saying they had the finest silks from Dangangu, and that the products were dazzling, with orders from all over the world. So the protagonist decided to trust him, and the vendor praised the excellent choice, and asked what kind of clothes he should prepare. But before the vendor could even finish his sentence, much to his delight, Jimmy declared that he wanted clothes for all three of them, 2 outfits for each person. Everyone there was delighted by the MC's generosity. The vendor knew that the next time Jimmy came by, he should offer him a grand banquet. While the hero was embraced by his disciples, he reflected that money was power, could even buy loyalty. Either you beat someone up or gift them something, always one extreme or the other. As the MC already knew that once you became friendly, it was easier to ask for favors. While the disciples had their measurements taken, Jimmy asked the vendor if he knew Lee Pelion. The hero openly said he'd heard rumors that he was a wicked man, and just wanted to confirm. But he knew Pelion collected protection fees, so maybe this vendor had information. Jimmy wanted to teach that man a lesson for attacking him in front of the shaman mountain, but he needed to find out who was really behind everything. The vendor revealed that many people had been asking about him in recent days, and that Wugujang warriors were also looking for him, so he assumed they were involved in large-scale illegal activities. The NC didn't know who the Wugujang were, and the vendor explained that the warriors from Wugujang had been patrolling the city, but Paul Yong was very good at hiding and never left a trace. Jimmy didn't like the idea of those damn Wugujang aiming for his target since he longed for the 29's reward. The group left the shop, with their priority being the capture of Paul Yong, and Jinmu exclaimed that when the clothes were ready, they should be sent to the Choosing Trade Center. Inside the Dagong Gujigo Palace, the second son Gongja reported that someone named the protagonist had appeared with 2 second-generation disciples. The clan master was curious about what kind of person the protagonist was. His son reported that he was at least a tiger cub, which enraged the master, who said he couldn't even deal with a first-generation shaman disciple. His son explained that he had sent Bonghu to test them, as it had been 10 years since the shamans had left the mountain, and he wanted to test them. The Murong clan master assumed his son hadn't fought them directly, and added that they must not disgrace themselves in front of the shamans. Afraid of being found out for losing, Ganja changed the subject, saying he had received reports that Jimmy was at the Choosing Trade Center. Hearing that, the master burst out laughing, saying he knew the shamans were broke, but didn't think they'd be foolish enough to associate with smugglers who called themselves merchants. His son was surprised to hear that the shamans were involved with smuggling, but the master explained that they probably didn't even know, since the shamans had cut ties with the world. They were unaware of current affairs. After that, the master asked if there was anything else to report, and the son said one of the Daosher's actions were odd. He ate meat, drank alcohol, and was very greedy, so the master concluded that the shamans were collapsing. Then the son also reported that one person had caught his attention, saying that he saw Wu Beizhang warriors, and thought they might be spying on the shaman Daosher. The master was surprised to hear that, and reflected that the son of the Wugujang was involved with the shamans. And the son confirmed it, saying his name was Jinny, but he still had doubts, because the Daosher named Jinmu was the one visiting Chuzhang. The master organized everything he had heard so far, and concluded that someone was trying to bite off more than they could chew, and would be torn apart. Now the master questioned what he should do, but he didn't care if that fool became the leader of the shamans. While his son didn't understand what was going on, but suddenly Murin decided to place the 20 Chung Wada warriors under his son's supervision, to keep an eye on the Dashi. The master didn't care if they died attempting an assassination, but if they got involved in illegal activities, they were to be captured, and he asked if he could handle that. Gungli hadn't expected this opportunity to come so quickly, and his eyes filled with greed. He knew the warriors were meant only for the clan master, and now he wanted to send a message that the shaman should never enter Dengangu again. The second son knew his father trusted him, and if he succeeded he could become second in command of the clan, a position still vacant despite there being many sons. Now the second son had his plan in mind, to humiliate the shamans and kick them out of Dengangu, and by doing so he would become second in command, surpassing his brothers while carrying out this mission. He longed for revenge against Jimmy. After that he said he wouldn't disappoint his father, and the master replied that he had full confidence in him. Now, the main group had already arrived at the Chunyang Commercial Center, and Jimmy was correcting his disciples' techniques, telling Chung Sang to advance with his form, The MC reflected that upon arriving at the commercial center, there was nothing for him to do since Chung-sang was absent from work, so he would have to train the kids for now. And on top of that, they were given a huge palace to stay in, far more than they needed, which surprised him a bit. The hero reflected that they were getting more than he expected, and that all of it was actually pretty nice, because the bigger the prey, the better. And suddenly behind Jinmu, the merchant appeared greeting him. The protagonist knew exactly why Chung-sang had approached the shamans. He was trying to use Jinny to become the master. However, Jimmy knew that only amateurs spoke their thoughts out loud, so he decided he would act friendly toward him to build trust, gather information, and then drive him into bankruptcy. The two exchanged polite greetings, and the merchant said he was so grateful when he heard that Jimmy was coming, and the hero thanked him for his generosity and hospitality. The merchant noticed that Jim's clothes were all dirty, and he exclaimed that he had encountered thieves along the way, but he had already dealt with them. Hearing this, the merchant yelled in anger, asking what kind of scumbags dared to attack the great dachis, and then the merchant assured him that he would assign bodyguards for the protagonist's safety, and Jimmy thanked him for his generosity. The merchant quickly said there was no need to thank him, as the shamans were like family to him, and that anything the protagonist needed, he should just ask. Hearing that, Jimmy was extremely pleased, asking if it was really true, and the merchant confirmed, saying he was already part of the family. Then, the hero revealed that he had been to a place called Pamuk Fabrics, and had bought clothes, so the merchant said he knew that place, and would send his general manager to pay the protagonist bill. The merchant argued that there was no way douchers could earn money while they were focused on training, so Jimmy should place that burden on his shoulders. After that, the merchant remembered it was the hero's first time outside, so he invited him to take a walk through Dangango, and also invited them to dinner, which made his disciples very excited. After scheduling everything, the merchant said he would return soon after changing clothes, and Jimmy waited for him after the merchant left. The MC reflected that he had approached him, as if they'd known each other for a decade, and that excessive kindness was hiding something underneath. The hero knew he was moving faster than expected. As they walked out, the merchant told his servant to contact the Wujing clan, and inform them about the shamans. The servant asked if that wouldn't be too dangerous, pointing out that based on the shaman's clothes, they had already been attacked by the Wu Gejang and failed, and if they failed again it would raise suspicion. Then the servant concluded by saying they should cut ties with them now. But he was interrupted by the merchant, said that Wu Gejang would take full responsibility, and they wouldn't be linked to anything. The merchant was absolutely sure they shouldn't cut ties now, because he had been surprised when he received the request for help to take down the protagonist. If he became the top disciple, surpassing Jinny, things would get much more difficult. However, given their current position, it would be much better to use the name of the shamans. If Jinny became the top disciple, instead of Jima, the merchant was aware of Jinny's weakness and planned to use it, plotting the assassination of Shu Haiyan. That way Jin-E would be dancing in the palm of his hand. The merchant urgently needed to cooperate with the Wu clan, as now they were under much more pressure, so they would know what to do after that. The merchant asked the manager how the gunpowder smuggling was going, and he replied that the exchange would happen in 5 days. Trading wheat for gunpowder was strictly forbidden, but that job brought in a lot of money. Money he had never seen in his entire life. The merchant revealed that there was an investigation into the wheat trade, so the manager had to be very careful. He was certain that no one could stop now, neither with the wheat nor with the Miriam. Inside the Wu Gejang clan, one of the servants reported that Jimmy was heading toward the next river, and that they had warriors stationed there who wouldn't talk. Clan master asked what kind of people Jimmy and his disciples were, as he had heard that even the Shipuni brothers had failed to capture them. The servant said that this time, they had chosen a very famous team of warriors, and if they failed, Gong Sakiak said he would handle it himself. Foran was the leader of Sakiak, the most infamous bandit in Dangagong, a street thief who had achieved great skill in swordsmanship. Many strong people followed him, and rumors said he had ties with the infamous Huxabang clan. The master asked if Gong Sakiak had been convinced. The servant said that when the muscle had heard they were looking for Paliang, he took the job first since Lee was his nephew, so there would be no excuse this time. but it was still uncertain how much he would ask for. But the master said he would pay him whatever he deserved, because once Jimmy was dead, they would destroy the giant and his clan, and place all the blame on them. Afterward it would go on record that bandits from an unknown clan killed the shaman disciple, and Wugujang would become the hero who avenged the shamans, and Jinny would rise to the top of the clan. Thus the future of the Wu family depended on Jinny, and they would kill anyone who stood in her way. The head of the family was determined to end the life of Jimmy, the first disciple of the shamans, for the future of his clan. On the banks of the Dangang River in the Red Light District, the main group was surrounded by women of the night. They had already latched onto the chubby one who wasn't resisting with them, saying he was full of muscles and inviting him to go out. And on the other side there was also Chung Sang in the same situation. Protagonist knew they were enjoying it. Soon Jimmy called their attention, saying they were only there to have dinner with the master of the trade center, and that they should hurry. The master, seeing the situation, said he couldn't judge but admitted he should have taken another route, avoiding the red light district. He hadn't thought of it though, because it was a shortcut he always used. He added, telling the MC that there was a place in Dangjing that dealt with green wines, and he'd love to introduce it. The hero reflected that they had passed by good restaurants, and it was obvious they were heading to a remote place, trying to distract them by going through the red light district. Jimmy concluded that the master had planned things very well, but didn't expect him to try to get rid of them so soon. But the protagonist was curious to see what he had prepared for them, so he decided to play along with his game. Jimmy's group had already reached the outer bank of the Dengang River, and the merchant invited them into a property called Moonless Tower. The MC realized that even if someone died in that place, no one would notice, so it was the perfect spot for the merchant's plan. Upon entering, they were greeted by an old man, who asked if they were from the trade center. The merchant quickly replied that he had reserved a table, and the old man guided them to the designated area. Observing everything, Jim thought that man was too old to be the owner of the place. He also noticed that there was no one else there besides them, and there hadn't been any clean done, so it was hard to believe that real guests would be brought to such a place. But as usual, the protagonist's disciples suspected nothing, and weren't paying any attention to their surroundings. At a certain point, the old man said that a boy would now guide them to the room. The hero also noticed that the boy, named Goel, had calluses on every joint of his fingers, and a waiter wouldn't have hands like that. So Jim, who assumed the boy must have had some combat experience. On arriving at the room that had been reserved, they found a grand banquet laid out on the table, sending the protagonist's disciples into a frenzy. They were also introduced to several attendants and musicians. Ready for the evening, the merchant servants said they would wait outside, and told them to enjoy without any rush. When the merchant said they could sit, the chubby one and Chung Sang went straight for the appetizers. After that, the merchant told the attendants they were taking too long to serve drinks to the dashi. The attendants approached each dashi present, and Jimmy already grew suspicious of this behavior. One of them began to pour the hero's drink, but he observed, reflecting, that he would never drink. Jimmy noticed a subtle difference in the color of his drink compared to Jim Jackson's. He thought there was no way not to notice such an obvious scheme, but suddenly a general entered the room saying it was an emergency. But the master merchant replied that he was tending to his guests, and asked what was going on. It seemed there had been a problem with Jenny and the delivery to the Guan government. Quickly the master merchant told the protagonist he had to take care of it personally, and would need to leave the room. Then the hero told him he could go and not worry about them. The merchant thanked him and said he'd return as soon as possible. But Jimmy already knew everything, as judging by his footsteps, he was clearly trying to escape. Such a cliché act was to be expected. The MC laid out everything he already knew. They were in a square room with only one entrance, and the drink appeared to be poisoned. Touching one of the girls, Jimmy said there was a fly and noticed he could feel her tense muscles. This body wasn't that of a waitress. It had to be something else. The musicians also had calluses on their palms, so they had to be experienced assassins, with bruises beneath their nails. The MC was now completely certain that they were all assassins, but he didn't understand why Jun Juxin would do this to him. He didn't understand why he wanted Jinny to become clan master. In his place, he didn't seem like someone trying to help or show loyalty, or, in the worst-case scenario, Ginny was the one behind it all. One of the attendants offered the drink to Jimmy. He told her she shouldn't offer drinks to a shaman, so he wasn't interested in drinking. Then he insisted that she drink it herself, and if she didn't he'd have to force her to drink it, to check exactly what she had mixed into it. Upon hearing that, everyone in the room realized they had been discovered. In response, the attendant tried to throw the drink at Jinmo, but he dodged it and the liquid hit another attendant. And that's when it was revealed the drink was poison. Chung Sang moved to try to reach his master and protect him, but before he realized it, one of the attendants already had him in her sights, ready to stab his head. Chung Sang managed to defend himself at the last second, grabbing the attendant's blade. Then he disarmed her by throwing a plate into her face, but when he went to strike back with his sword, she dodged and tried to kick with a blade attached to her foot, but the pretty boy managed to dodge it at the last moment. The attendant stepped back, waiting for Chung Sang's move, while Chung Woo was still clueless about what was happening, about to be attacked by the attendant next to him. They were all calling out to Jinma, begging him to save them, which only reinforced Jimmy's theory that the chubby one was an idiot. While the protagonist was being attacked from both sides, he wondered how someone could be so useless all the time, but without much trouble he defended himself from the two attackers, and threw one of them onto the table, breaking it in half. Jimmy and Chung Sang tried to coordinate an attack by throwing objects at the musicians, who already alert ran away. To counter-attack, they pulled out several needles and threw them at the protagonist. With quick reflexes, the two used the broken tables as shields to defend themselves from the needles, which ended up hitting only the women, and Chung Woo, the pretty boy, panicked at seeing the chubby one on the floor wounded. He held him in his arms asking if he was okay, and got the reply that he couldn't feel his body, and that he was going to die soon. But the hero sniffing the needles noticed something interesting. He revealed to everyone that it was a substance that caused paralysis, so the fat one would be fine if they removed it from his body. Unlike the musician enemies, Jimmy said, their abilities were useless if they couldn't control their power, and just kept attacking non-stop. Still, they needed to train if they intended to make a living as assassins. They were shocked, and asked when the protagonist realized it was all a setup. The hero, with his sharp insight, said he had known from the very beginning, but with so many grotesque mistakes, he didn't even know where to begin. Jimmy added that he knew Jun Juxin had hired them, and asked if he had also hired Pal Lion, but the Ennis replied that they didn't sell information about their own clients. This surprised the MC, but without wasting time, he realized he wouldn't get an answer, and punched his enemy right in the face, telling him to shut up for good. They were stunned by Jimmy's speed and boldness, and attacking without warning. They began to wonder what kind of dousher he was, but before that musician could react, he was caught off guard from behind with a kick, dropping to his knees and having Chung Sang's sword turned on him. Telling him not to move, the long-haired one asked their boss what they should do with the enemies. However, Jim knew they wouldn't sell any information, so terrified the musician, Jimmy told Jin Woo to just kill him and get it over with. This sent the man into a panic. As Chung Sang was about to behead him, he wondered if they were really dashing. But suddenly the door was shattered and thrown aside, and a young man quickly saved the musician, who was about to be executed. The hero recognized the young man, saying he had been waiting for him, and remembered his name was Goel, because he was different from the others. But Goel was deeply enraged, assuming they had killed the women, and wondering if a dousher was really capable of that. Jimmy tried to reverse the situation, saying it was a misunderstanding, and that they weren't the ones who had killed them, but Goel wouldn't listen. Goel was ready to deliver a painful death to them, calling them damned cruel scumbags, but the protagonist kept insisting that they weren't the ones who committed that act. The confrontation between Goel and the shamans was about to begin. Goel stood furious before the merciless, ordering an attack. Jim, analyzing his abilities and level, concluded that he wasn't his opponent, and that fighting him would only tarnish his reputation. So he pointed to the chubby one to fight Goel, saying it would be good experience for him, seeing that he was unarmed. Chung Woo was very uneasy at the sight of his opponent's murderous aura. He panicked, wondering what to do, since he had never fought in a real battle before. However, he knew that if he screwed up, the MC would be angry, What the chubby one truly feared was Jimmy being disappointed in him. But after that, he confidently said he could win. Chung Woo recalled his past experiences, reflecting that whenever the MC said those words to him, somehow he always managed to win, even when it seemed impossible. Determined, he said he needed to believe in himself, something he had never done until now. But Jim had always believed in him from the start. Standing before his opponent, he knew he couldn't let that trust go to waste. And so he raised his guard and was now ready to fight, holding on to the hero's words that he would win. Jimmy, observing him, was certain that something good was about to happen. And so the fight began with Chung Woo charging toward his opponent. He tried to land a punch, but was blocked and took a solid kick to the stomach. He didn't let it end there, and countered with a strike to the opponent's wrist. After that, they began exchanging insane, lightning-fast punches until the chubby one stood out with a heavy punch that sent his opponent flying. Goel couldn't understand what was wrong with his opponent. He was fast despite his heavy body, and channeled his aura through his entire body, making it feel like a rock had hit him. The protagonist had trained him with modified strikes, drastically increasing his power and speed. Jim knew that Chung Woo only needed self-confidence to become a great legend. The already defeated musicians watching the battle reflected that, at this rate, they would be wiped out. So one of them prepared a sneak attack while the others were focused, but was quickly stopped by Chung Sang, who had been keeping an eye on him with a precise slash to his back. Gowal, seeing the pretty boy's move, got distracted, opening a chance for the chubby one to strike. And so Chung Woo finally landed a solid punch straight to his face. Goal lost all his balance and focus, and after that the chubby one finished him off with the Blue Dragon's Northern Star Fist. And so Goal went flying across the room and hit the ground defeated. Jim, watching, was proud, saying that the fat guy had improved a lot. And now that Gowl was knocked out, all that was left was to clean up the mess. When suddenly from afar an attack came flying toward the chubby one. The hero had already noticed it in advance, and shouted for Chung Woo to dodge. Luckily he managed to dodge while carrying Gowl at the last moment. Pudgy One explained that when he was attacked, he realized it wasn't a weapon but a technique. Chung Sang said it must be a veteran, and Jimmy knew he was right, but still hadn't sensed the presence of any martial artist nearby. So he wondered who it could be this time, until a mysterious figure emerged from the shadows, saying it was impressive that the protagonist had been able to see his attack. But to Jim's surprise, the one who appeared was just an old man. In that world there were different kinds of arts. The first were material arts, using an object to channel and control one's energy, used by most people who wield swords. The next level was projection arts, which allowed users to launch their techniques in any direction, something only highly talented and experienced people could do. Jimin knew he was able to use that in his current body, but he hadn't yet reached a level beyond that. Still, just by standing in front of that old man, he could feel it, feeling his power. He knew that old man had reached a level higher than most people. The hero knew that if he was unlucky, this guy might be even stronger than he imagined, and he wondered how much money had been spent trying to eliminate him. The old man analyzed Jimu and said he was impressive, probably the strongest in his group, and that he'd never heard of anyone like him among the shamans. The protagonist asked if he had gone deaf from old age, and the old man was surprised by Jimmy's attitude, but didn't care much. The MC went on saying, the old man should be ashamed of accepting a contract to kill him. If he was so strong he could live peacefully anywhere. Then the old man revealed that he hadn't accepted any contract, which made the hero ask if he wasn't with the other guys. The old man didn't understand and said he was wondering the same. The old man stated that he was just using the kids, so he might be working with them or not. The protagonist lost his patience and asked again whether or not he was with them, and whether he even knew what it meant to be with someone, while Jimmy kept ranting, saying the old man must be suffering from memory loss. The old man was analyzing and realizing that someone was targeting him. Using the power of his eyes, he discovered that many influential and evil people were after him. While Jimmy was still angry from not getting any answers, the old man exclaimed that people with the worst intentions, even the judges and Langs, were after him, and he wondered what that young shaman had done to attract so much attention. The hero didn't understand anything the old man said about malicious intentions. Then the old man pointed at Goel, saying he only needed him alive, and if they handed him over, he pretended he never saw them. The old man stated the deal was beneficial for both of them, but Jim thought it wasn't like him to spare someone who tried to kill him. Still, in this situation, he preferred to avoid a fight. He knew he wouldn't be able to move forward while carrying that weight, so he accepted the offer. He told Chong-woo to lay go all down, and added one more thing to the agreement. He requested a change of position, since the exit was on the other side, and Jim-woo would feel safer if he left first. The old man had no objections, and said it would be just as the hero wanted. After the exchange was made, Jimmy said he'd see the old man some other time, but just as they were about to leave, the old man prepared a sudden attack. Protagonist's first reaction was to order his disciples to run away as fast as they could, but it was already too late. The attack was launched and was about to hit Jimmy. Surprisingly, the hero channeled the wind explosion's power into his hands, and redirected the old man's powerful attack in another direction. The old man was astonished by how he used the wind of the shamans, because if Jimmy had charged straight in, he would have easily been defeated. The MC, however, used the whirling wind wall, which was normally employed for an explosion, but in this case, he compressed the wind to form a barrier in front of him, recognizing the enemy's strike. Thus the old man understood that Jimmy's basic understanding of the martial arts would surpass that of people several decades older than him. The elder was truly astonished, because he knew it wasn't possible to do something like that without complete comprehension of the arts and without experience. It would never succeed, so he questioned where they had found this boy. The hero, not entirely convinced, said that was something he wanted to know too. But for someone as powerful as that old man, he had never heard of him. Jimmy added that among the shamans, the Zhuge Liangs and others, he had never heard of anyone like that old man, and no matter how much he thought about it, he had no idea who he was. So the protagonist directly asked the elder who he was, but the old man left Jimmy without an answer, and merely exclaimed that there was no need to tell. Someone who was about to die. A projectile attack was launched toward the shamans, faster than the eye could see, but it was deflected by the hero's sword. The disciples were shocked when they realized they hadn't seen anything of that attack. Jimmy knew the situation was dire, as the old man could change his martial arts into any form at will. The elder was surprised that the protagonist could also sense that. At his age, nevertheless, he said all the training he had done to form his power was useless, and so he decided, Jim, you should die. The hero was already familiar with the blood rush technique, so he shouted for his disciples to run as far away as possible, issuing it as a command. He understood that the old man was at the highest level, and that if he went all out, they would all die. It was impossible to block it with projection techniques alone, but even so, Jim was determined to buy a little time for his disciples to escape. While he protected them, the protagonist charged into an intense battle against the elder, who kept firing projectiles at Jim. Jimmy found himself increasingly cornered, carrying what he could with his sword, but with great difficulty. He remained standing ready for the next move. He dashed toward the old man to close the distance, and launched a direct attack, which by the way didn't work. So he continued with multiple assaults against the elder. But in the end, when Jimmy got tired, the old man stepped on his sword. With that, he said, he admired Jimmy's effort and willpower to ensure his brothers escaped, but he was already getting bored. To the old man, the result was obvious. But if the hero were to die, the old man thought it would be better to release all his power. So the elder retreated once more, while Jin-woo was thankful that his disciples had managed to escape safely. At that moment, the protagonist was determined to launch one more attack, which might very well be his end to that extremely powerful elder. Jimmy was practically a tiny, insignificant ant, but the protagonist had faith that some ants were brave enough to counterattack, even when backed into a corner. And so he unleashed an energy-filled attack toward the old man, slicing through multiple layers of air. The old man was impressed to see more martial arts, but he knew it was all just for show. He could see right through Jimmy. To hold him back, the elder summoned an elemental wall, using his skills to deflect the hero's strikes. The MC, unsatisfied, rushed in with his blade, trying to shatter the wall created by the old man, but it resulted in nothing, only in the breaking of his sword. After this frantic clash, the old man exclaimed that he now understood. The flashy techniques were distraction, and the real attack was coming from behind him. Jim had done his best, but what the elder hadn't expected was to actually be struck in the face. Then the hero explained that before attacking, he had prepared a gift for predictable old men like him, knowing he'd start preaching after blocking all the attacks. The protagonist revealed that he tied it, so that when the elder began his speech, he'd get hit during it thus. Jimmy was fully confident that the old man had lost, but without saying a word, the elder, enraged, suddenly attacked the protagonist with a palm strike at full speed, sending the hero flying out of the room, soaring several meters through the air. Jimmy hadn't even seen the old man move or pull his hand back. He exclaimed that it felt like the old man was controlling space itself, something he didn't even know was possible. Meanwhile, the old man was in disbelief that the protagonist had managed to block the attack he had intended to kill with. Upon re-evaluating, the old man understood that the moment his hand struck Jimmy, the boy had absorbed the blow, spinning it around within that short instant space. Not satisfied, the old man launches another strike toward the protagonist, who quickly realizes the old man was still coming at him. Once again, he manages to deflect the projectile with his sword at the last second, and falls into the depths of the sea. The composed old man reflects that Jimmy blocked his attack twice, making him skilled and terrifying, and thus concludes that he must be killed immediately. However, he senses the presence of Zhang Liang and others. The old man knows that if he stays there showing off, the damn cultivator who had been tracking him might catch up. Unwilling to take further risks, the old man decides to erase all traces of his presence and vanishes, using a spell to soar through the skies. He exclaims that the young man was incredibly lucky, and with that he disappears into the distance. Finally, the protagonist disciples managed to rescue him from the bottom of the sea, deeply worried about his condition. But Jimmy could only think about who that old man was, and why he didn't finish him off right then. With that, he concludes that the old man was insanely good in a fight. The hero's disciples begged him not to die, while Jimmy said he couldn't hold on anymore with that body, that his arms were crumbling and his ki had been severely damaged. He exclaimed that he never imagined Gun Jack-san would hire that old monster to kill him, and that more surprises might be waiting. Meanwhile, the protagonist reflected that he needed to find a safe place to recover. A figure stood over them, surprised that they were still alive. This figure was in disbelief upon seeing that the 7 bandits had failed to capture them, and on top of that died, crushed under the building's collapse. And so his gang regrouped with him, as the man remarked that the bandits couldn't even take down 3 young shamans. The hero thought it was too late to escape, but still believed they had been lucky. The muscular figure exclaimed that he had been worried about returning without any reward, but now they might even ask for a bonus from the Wu family. Jimmy tries to connect all the events he's witnessed so far, noticing that several powerful men have come after him, and it all seemed connected. He was already exhausted from all this madness, having faced enemy after enemy, encountering dozens of them while in his worst condition. The man in front of him had mastery over vertigo techniques, praised as elite in most clans, capable of becoming the top disciple in established ones. So the protagonist assumed there must be hidden treasures in Dangangu, since there was no other explanation for these kinds of men showing up there taking control of the situation. Jimmy tells Chung Sang to step back, and reflects to himself that if he survives this, he will go after Jim Jackson personally. After that, the MC directs his words to the big man, saying he feels extremely awful right now, and that the guy should stop showing off before he gets killed. Jimmy only said that to provoke him and buy some time, but Gong Sikyo couldn't understand why he was being so arrogant, and figured Jimmy had probably lost his mind to talk to him like that with full boldness. The protagonist says he doesn't care and will forgive him this time, even giving him a good chance to escape. Gong Sakya was truly confused upon realizing the hero didn't recognize him, as everyone in the neighborhood knew his name. But Jimmy exclaims that he'd never acknowledge a third-rate thug like him. With that, the hero calls him out for a fight, saying he'd never lose to some street thug, which makes Gong's entire gang burst out laughing. Gong had never met someone as crazy as the protagonist. He really thought Jimmy was a rare gem. While distracted, Jimmy launches a swift strike at him, drawing blood from his face. Gong Sekiho wondered what kind of shaman the protagonist was to land a sudden attack like that, but Jimmy realizes he had failed miserably, only making a shallow cut when he had aimed for the opponent's neck. Wasting no time, the muscleman launches a counter-attack toward the hero, but luckily Jimmy manages to block it with the pommel of his sword. Even so, the impact throws the protagonist backward, and he panics, upon realizing that a single blow made him extremely dizzy. Close to fainting, the hero's disciples were tremendously worried about him. The protagonist knew that if his body had been in shape, beating that man would have been nothing. The brute couldn't accept the level of disrespect and lack of honor shown by Jim. Now he would teach punks like him how to respect and be respected, and to fix the hero's attitude. Gong Sae Kyung begins his flurry of attacks. However, Jim continues to resist. But he knew this opponent would not be easy. The strength the giant exerted was tremendous, and so was his speed until Gong Sekiho launched an attack that cornered the protagonist against a tree, and so he was being pressured by his opponent, who was now determined to kill him. Jimmy found himself with no way out, as he could no longer withstand repelling the attack, kept searching for a way to escape all that chaos. Suddenly the hero remembered the words of that old man, who said that many wicked people were after him, questioning what he had done. Connecting the dots, the protagonist realized that the evil intention thugs referred to Sachik's gang, and the old man had also mentioned the Jiggles, and that old man wouldn't make a mistake. So Jinwoo assumed the old man left without killing him, because the Jiggles had arrived. With that in mind, the MC concluded that even if people said power was everything, the Jiggles would never join hands with Thug. To confirm his theory, he looked around, and finally spotted the Jiggles marching in his direction, and so he realized he had found his salvation. Gong Sekyak saw the protagonist was distracted, so if he launched another attack. But to his surprise, Jimmy managed to block it again. Then with confidence, the hero asked the musclehead if he was trying to get himself killed, otherwise he should back off. To prove his point, the protagonist asked if he didn't feel that presence, and then told him to look around while sheathing his sword. The giant wondered why Jimmy was so relaxed at that moment, and concluded that something was definitely off. Their eyes finally met with the Jiggle family leaving Gong Sekyak in shock. He truly couldn't understand why the Jiggle family was there. Jimmy waved at the Jiggles in a friendly manner, saying he almost got killed because they were late. He exclaimed that if he hadn't been injured, the situation would have been different. While the musclehead wondered if they were that close. Gong Sae Kyung thought the shaman had asked for help from the Jagal family, but that didn't make sense, since both families competed for control over Hobak Castle. Then the giant came to the conclusion that, since they were established clans, they would assist each other when dealing with a lesser clan leader. Now the musclehead saw himself cornered by those bastards. If he advanced, the Jagal family would strip him of his army and he'd be destroyed. But if he let the shaman escape, he'd be hunted for eternity. Seeing Gong Sae Kek's desperation, the hero knew he was overthinking everything for no reason. Jimmy knew that the Jiggles wouldn't help him, after being humiliated before, and with their rigid personalities, they wouldn't forget so easily. Confident in his assumption, the MC felt they had followed him to get revenge, but the giant had no way of knowing that. Now he was determined to use this moment to escape, telling his disciples they were leaving immediately. The second son of the Jiggles exclaimed that Jim had no idea. They were there to watch him and catch him doing something illegal. He had headed there after hearing that the hero was at the Gum Juksan restaurant, which had gone missing, and ended up encountering the sudden presence of Satya. It was said that the musclehead was well known by the Jiggles, and even though he was a street thug, he had mastery over his weapon and ties with the Black Plague clan. Thus Ganjoli assumed he was definitely involved in illegal activities related to the Black Plague clan. Thinking this might be a treasure trove, John was determined to keep watching until they did something illegal, so he could finally become the master of his clan. Then one of Ganjali's allies said he thought the shamans and Psychiac were fighting each other. However, June reflected that perhaps they had internal conflict while engaging in illegal acts, and considering their personalities, that might really be the case. Ganjali's ally once again pointed out to his master that the shamans were losing to the musclehead, and only pretended to be with them to escape. But it was already too late, as the shamans were now long gone. Meanwhile, Gong Sae Kyung was trying to decide whether or not to fight the Jigik family members. As his servant asked what they should do, Gung-ho Lee was left in disbelief upon realizing they had been used as a distraction for escape. Now the main group had headed to the guest house in the city center, making Chung Sang question if that was really the right decision. Then Jimmy explained that this would be the last place they'd look, because they knew no one would ever flee to the center of Dengangu, which was essentially their own home ground, so they assumed the enemies would first search the path toward the territory of the shamans. Jinmu was deeply enraged with all those bastards after him, even though he didn't even know them, and so he said he would never forgive them. Suddenly Jinmu asks his disciples if they had with them the pill called Yosang, and they confirmed that they did. Yosang pills help control internal injuries. They had received these items when they came down from the shaman mountain, with a total of 10 pills in his hand. Jinmu wastes no time and swallows all of them. So full of fury, Jinmu didn't care if it was 10 or 100 pills. He just wanted to recover as fast as possible, to strike Gong Sakai again. Jinmu knew that the Jiggle family had probably already left, and that Sakai was out looking for them. And Jinmu, more than anyone, understood how smaller clans operated. They would only search for a day, and if they didn't find Jinmu, they would flee, which worried him greatly, as one day wasn't enough to fully recover his mana and injuries. But even so, he had his plans. Jinmu proceeds to use a technique called mana application on the vein, which temporarily boosts his mana, regardless of whether the energy he had cultivated was pure or dark. This technique was very dangerous because of its many side effects, but Jinmu didn't care at all. Driven by fury, Jinmu says he would snap the necks of those trying to ruin his life, and would never let them live. In the territory of the Jiggle clan, Ganjali was being judged by his father, who said he should have killed the shamans, along with the smaller clans, furious for having lent his private army for nothing. After so much disappointment, the clan master tells John that he is no longer his son. However, the son begs for just one more chance. He promises that he would find them this time and help Gong Sakia kill them. But the clan master only grew angrier with every word his son spoke, especially after he said he would help Sachiko kill the disciples. Ganji Lee was desperate, as he hadn't meant to say that, but now it was too late. He pleads for his father to listen, begging for forgiveness and saying he didn't mean it, until the master loses his patience and slaps his son's face, telling him to shut up. After that, the master calls for his servant Modaji, who quickly answers. The master orders him to take his son back home that very moment, and the servant simply obeys the command. The fool kept screaming and begging for his father to listen to him, but he wouldn't. His father's last words were that he should stay at home until further orders, and if he stepped outside, he would break his legs as he was being taken away. Ganjali cried and reflected that his father was truly merciless. Recalling past events, John concludes that he had been humiliated several times and dared by Jinmu, and because of him, he had lost the trust of his father, a trust that took a long time to earn. Now Ganjali harbored an immense hatred for Jinmu, blaming him for the loss of all his achievements. A man who overheard everything tells the second son that he had been scolded by their father again. But that was the last voice the fool wanted to hear at that moment. The first son of the Jiggle clan, Gak, says his brother's stupidity continued. The first son exclaims that he thought his brother would actually accomplish something this time, but either way he wasn't capable of anything. So he arrogantly asks why his brother doesn't just leave the family and apply to the shamans. The first son says he's sure the shamans would accept him, since he had already helped them once. And then he leaves, calling his brother a fool. As the first son enters their father's room, Jun feels an immense desire to kill him, but Ganji had faith that his brother wouldn't be able to endure his opposition for long, and that one day he would surpass him and become master of the guild. In the street bandit region of Dangangu, Sakigake was berating his subordinates. The reason was that they hadn't found Jinmu and the others, even though there were few entrances to the shame and nothing. One of them apologized for not finding the protagonist, but their master, already enraged, holds him close, brutalizing him, and yelling that they should have gotten help from everyone, whether they knew how to fight or not. Yet they couldn't even find 3 injured bastards. The servant, being choked, reports that, as instructed, he had placed people disguised as beggars, thieves and others to track them, but there were still no results. Ganjali becomes even more furious and throws the servant aside, calling him a useless bastard. Gonzalez knew they had been tricked and that, after the shamans escaped, they left guards behind to monitor, but those guards never returned. John, after being deceived, feared that Jimmy would head to the mountains and report to the other shamans, so he needed to kill him as quickly as possible. He knew that after that the shamans would show up in groups, as they were extremely sensitive when it came to their disciples, and would make him pay the price for targeting them. Gong Sakyap was aware that his Black Plague clan supported him, but he couldn't expect any help, as they might cast him out if he stirred up conflict with the shamans. More than anything, he needed to kill that shaman and finally cover up all the evidence. He ordered one of his servants to find the Wu family and tell them that a shaman disciple had escaped. Asking for help, the servant doubted that the Wu family would help them, but Psychic exclaimed that if they were in trouble, then the Wu would be too, so they had no choice but to help. Finally, the musclehead dismissed his men, saying the more people searching, the better, and the Wu family was skilled and would be a great help. But just as the servants were opening the door to leave, a sudden explosion blasted them backward. Everyone inside went on high alert due to the immense noise. There stood Jim with his disciples, full of confidence, saying that with such a big garden, the base was extremely easy to find. Provoking Sakiel, the hero asked if he missed him, and said he was excited to have some fun. Now the protagonist stood in front of all his enemies, alongside his disciples. The expression on their faces was like they had seen a ghost. Jimmy now questioned Gong Sakyok, asking if he was surprised to see the person, who was supposed to have run away, standing right in front of him, instead of going to the shamans. The giant exclaimed that the hero had a lot of balls to show up there alone, and for that he could only be thankful. Wasting no time, the master ordered his allies to kill him first. Jim instructed his disciples to stay behind him, and then he began releasing his ki. The protagonist hadn't completely healed from his injuries, and had only recovered half of his strength with the pills. Even so, his attacks had become much stronger, amplifying the power in his veins. He was determined to reap the lives of his enemies. He then initiated his shaman sword technique with a spinning attack called Soul-Devouring Tornado. After Jimmy's attack, nothing remained. Gong Sakyo was horrified to see a ki sword over 2 meters long. He knew that the hero's abilities were far beyond his own. Much stronger than him, the brute knew that to survive, he had to escape and then join forces with the Wu family. But the protagonist wouldn't let that happen. As soon as he saw him trying to flee, he threw a ki blast in his direction. Luckily, Gong Sae Kyung managed to deflect the blast at the last second, but was still thrown far away and took damage. The musclehead couldn't believe that those bastards from the Wu family had sent him to kill a warrior capable of firing ki bullets. Gong Sae Kyung was aware of the protagonist level, and knew he couldn't fight him on equal terms, making escape his only option. But he had a plan if he got close enough. He could use his firearm that shot poisonous needles, called the King's Needle. Believing that no one could dodge the needles at close range, he needed to distract Jimmu, so he dropped to his knees and began to beg for forgiveness. The giant started by saying that the sin he committed was worthy of death, that he had been blinded by money, and asked the hero to spare his life. The brute believed that shaman disciples were fools, who might believe in redemption through discipline, so he pleaded in hopes that the hero would lower his guard. Gong Sekyek anxiously awaited the moment the MC would step into his attack range, and as soon as he did, he fired his lethal firearm. The protagonist already knew everything and acted first, disarming him and yanking him by the hair. Jinmu, while confronting him, exclaimed that he could easily guess what trash like him had schemed, trying to save face. The giant claimed that everything was just a misunderstanding, but the protagonist, exhausted with the situation and out of patience, told him to shut up and began another beating. After a while of non-stop punches, the hero's disciples woke Gong Stacky up with a bucket of cold water, and once he was conscious again, the protagonist was ready to ask him several questions, ordering him to answer truthfully, saying he should only nod in response. The hero began by asking who hired him, and whether it was the Wu family or not. Ansi didn't know the Wu family, but he had heard they were very fair, and still couldn't understand why they tried to kill him. Without any grudge, Jimmy wanted to attack them right then and there, but his vain amplification would soon wear off, so he couldn't do anything. So the hero had the idea of destroying the Shenyang Commercial Center, but Xiang Xiang opposed it. He argued that Jimmy's body still needed to recover completely, and besides, the commercial center was heavily guarded. But to Xiang Xiang's surprise, Jimmy had devised an evil plan, saying they wouldn't be the ones to destroy the commercial center. And so the protagonist turns to Gong Saikiak and says they should have a little chat. Sometime later at the commercial center, the staff hears a loud commotion, and one of them reports it as an emergency. It is reported that the Sasha clan is attacking the center, and all the criminals were already inside killing each other. While people wondered what had happened after the attack on the center, the bandits managed to take everyone hostage, both inside and outside the building. Jimmy was pleased with the outcome, and comments to Shishiak that the situation was resolved quickly, and that it looked like he had trained his subordinates very well. One of the hostages reflects that the smaller clans were not loyal, but never expected they would betray the ones who had hired them. Now furious, Jimmy asks the leader where that bastard John Juk-sun was, and he questioned why there were only a few guards there. The general arrogantly responds that it's none of Jimmy's business, and that he should act like a normal shaman, and returned to his mountain to live in seclusion. But upon hearing that, Gong Shirshiak wastes no time, and punishes the general with a heavy kick to the stomach. He continues subjugating the general, saying he wasn't talking to just anyone. The beating continues, and the general could tell Shirshiak wasn't pretending. He truly intended to kill him to prove his loyalty to the shamans. He wondered what had happened to make him change, so much as when he had left, it was with the goal of killing the shaman disciples. Before all of this, Jim had told Shasik that if he helped him, he would forget all the crimes he had committed against them. So Shasik knew that if he could overcome this crisis, he could go on living as a boss in the back alleys. He thought he'd be hunted by shamans for the rest of his life, so he should repay Jimmy's generosity. After the general was beaten up so badly, Jimmy says that's enough and that he would ask again. He asks where Jay, owner of Oxen, was, and warns not to play games, demanding a straight answer. However, Jimmy says he could just kill him and ask anyone else there, as surely one of them would know where his target was. All the hostages present feel a deep fear, and finally the general opens his mouth, saying that his boss was handling illegal business, and that because the exchange was dangerous, he had taken several of the main guards with him, hence the few guards left behind. Upon hearing that, Jimmy thinks he could take advantage of the situation and ambush them, taking all their goods and money. Looking to get more information, Jimmy asks why he would need so many subordinates. Curious, he asks what kind of exchange was taking place, but the general refuses to speak, and so Jim threatens him by saying Sasha could kill him now. But suddenly, the general no longer cared and starts spilling everything, saying that the merchandise was gunpowder. Everyone present is shocked by the answer, realizing the level of insanity. Gunpowder was typically used during New Year and general festivities as fireworks, but in the context of the realms, it was the fuel for cannons essential for war. Moreover, martial artists were strictly forbidden from getting near gunpowder, and a treaty had been signed between the king and martial artists, stating that they would not get involved in such matters, and vice versa. This law was established when the country was founded, with the help of martial artists, and that tradition was upheld to this day. To maintain order, there were boundaries such as not harming civilian homes, not getting involved in treason, and never laying hands on military-grade gunpowder from the government. If any of these rules were broken, all involved would be wiped out by thousands of soldiers. From that, Jimmy reflects that such a small commercial center was trading gunpowder, making him think John Young-sun was truly insane. Chung Sang, with his rational mindset, says that, in the case of gunpowder, they should report it to the disciplinary committee. However, the protagonist, with his plan to take the goods, considers dropping the idea. When the hero asks where the location is, he is told that they were at the northern lake of the Junko fields. From that point, Jimmy ordered the handsome one to alert the disciplinary committee about the illegal gunpowder trade, saying he would head straight to the northern lake. The MC exclaimed that they had no time, and needed to arrive before the deal was completed. Otherwise, they would have no evidence of the illegal trade. But suddenly Chung Sang, insistent, said his master couldn't do that, worried about the hero's health. The long-haired one said he would go with him, because he couldn't be at peace knowing Jimmy would be in danger. But gently, with a smile on his face, Jimmy told Chung Sang to trust in his lord. The protagonist said he would go there to stall them, and the handsome one would bring the disciplinary committee with him. Now Chung Sang understood that Jimmy wasn't afraid to risk his life for a greater good, and was truly following the path of the shamans. After that, the pretty boy accepted the order, and said he would return from the committee as quickly as possible, and the MC also set off on his mission. Chung Hansen was fully aware that he had to move fast, as he couldn't let his lord fight alone. On the other side, Jimin knew he had to arrive before the committee, because even if he couldn't seize the gunpowder, he wanted to intercept the money. In northern Donggangdo in the reed field, the smugglers were walking toward the trade site, while Jun Juxian told them to watch for any strange movements. They said the buyer still hadn't arrived, so they had a bit of time before the exchange. The smuggler reflected that this illegal gunpowder trade was his biggest deal. So far he was trading 5 boxes of gunpowder, which had taken him 5 months to gather, and he paid 4 times the market price for them, investing almost his entire fortune. But he didn't care about the money he had spent, because even having paid 4 times more, he would sell it for 10 times the price, and with the profit he planned to buy out the businesses in Dengangu. Then he would leave smuggling behind, and become a legitimate commercial center, until his men spotted something in the sea. It was the buyers signaling their arrival. The buyers had arrived, so Jim Jackson ordered everyone to prepare. With both sides now face to face, they asked where the product was. Then the swindler revealed his carts full of wheat, and after that, the trader showed a chest filled with 10 boxes of gold crowns. The scammer's eyes lit up with greed, and he said the deal was done. But suddenly 3 shadows appeared in the sky to interrupt them, and there they were. They claimed Jimmy Sakuya and the chubby guy. Jimmy said that even though he had pushed him toward a death sentence, the merchant's life hadn't improved. In disbelief, the scammer said, "Jim, you should be dead," and didn't understand why Gong Sakya was by his side. He assumed they were a team. The common tried to stay calm as he got 20 highly trained guards with him. So confidently the merchant said that if Jim had turned a blind eye, he could have walked away alive. But now he planned to kill him without leaving a trace. And so the battle began, and the MC ordered his followers to attack as well. Gong Satak's strength was unimaginable. He could slice his enemies in half with little effort. He was also extremely resistant to any kind of blow. Even when attacked from behind, he would strike back and hurl his enemy directly on top of Jim Jackson. After falling from his horse, the scammer questioned how things had ended up like that, and unfortunately his guards were being utterly decimated, and his plan would be ruined if things continued like that. He knew his alliance with the shamans was over, and that his commercial center would be wiped out. So with no escape, he activated his plan B. That plan consisted of grabbing all the money and escaping, but he was interrupted by the buyers pointed their weapons at him. They declared that the deal was off, and that they would be taking the gold back. Jim Jackson tried to negotiate, saying they could kill the intruders together, letting them keep the gunpowder while he kept the gold. But the buyers found that extremely suspicious. They claimed that the intruders had arrived at the exact moment of the trade, presuming that the merchant was with them, trying to stab them in the back. The buyer said they never bet their lives on uncertainties, and ordered the swindler to get lost. And while the scammer was in a tight spot with that skeptical man, Jim suddenly appeared, kicking the buyer in the face. Impressed, the swindler thought the protagonist had come to save him, and that, in the end, he was a righteous man. But his fantasy was quickly shattered, as Jimmy punched him in the face without hesitation. From there the hero seized the treasure, saying it was his and that, if they didn't want to die, they better get lost. The battle was still heated as Jim negotiated with the buyers, telling them to get lost, but if they wanted to fight him, he wouldn't stop them, and the buyers said they wouldn't let it slide. But suddenly a rain of arrows was fired on everyone. Chaos broke out until it was revealed that the disciplinary committee was already there, along with Chung Sang. From that point on, the committee began to pressure all the bandits present. While Chung Sang looked for his master, Jimmy was only thinking that if the committee found the gold, they would confiscate it. Seeing the whole situation, the buyers quickly decided to flee, and the protagonist knew there wasn't enough time to hide the gold, so he would have to rely on luck. He calls Chung Woo and hands him the treasure chest, telling him to run to a place where no one was around, and so the chubby one heads off carrying the chest, following his master's orders. And Jimmy knew it was risky, but it was his only option. But while that was happening, the MC was trying to escape, until Jimmy spots him and says they had a lot to talk about, since that smuggler had made several attempts on his life. Faced with that, the hero says the man should be ready, and once again Jimmu begins his beatdown, leaving his opponent unconscious. Both Chung Sang and the committee who were watching the beating say the protagonist did a good job. Chung Sang reflects that it was strange to say good job after he had just beaten someone up, but he felt like he had to say something. Meanwhile, the committee members bowed, even without knowing Jimmu because of the sheer brutality he radiated, and so the report was that the situation had been resolved. They managed to capture all the gunpowder smugglers, along with Gong Sa-yok, who did not resist arrest, believing firmly that the protagonist would help him, since they were on the same team, so he had nothing to worry about. But on the other hand, the hero was negotiating with the committee how much money he would get for capturing the musclehead. One of the members reveals that the reward was 100 silver, and the committee member hands Jimmy the paperwork so he could collect it. The committee thanked the protagonist deeply for helping them capture Sachiuk and several gunpowder smugglers, while Sachiuk looked on deeply confused, and once he understood the situation, he screamed that Jimmy was a damn traitor. The hero, with great sensibility, reflects that there's no reason to forgive someone who tried to kill him, and that Suchi got what he deserved. But as the committee was already about to leave, the MC asks them to wait, and inquires if there was any reward for reporting the smugglers. Then the committee explains that if Jimmy appeared at the disciplinary committee, they would report to Gion, and with the capture of Jim Juxon, the commercial sender's property would be confiscated. Upon hearing that, the hero was terrified, realizing that property probably had a lot of rewards inside. He reflects that if he had known, he would have taken a little something for himself when he attacked his enemies. After that, Jim concludes that there was no going back, so he would be satisfied with what he already had, and tells the committee member that he will wait for his great reward. From there, the event ended in that way, with the criminals arrested. Only one thing remained: the protagonist and his disciples knock on the door of a certain establishment, and are greeted by an old man asking who would be calling so early. But before anything else, the three of them enter the place and take over the property, asking for 3 cups of tea. The old man running the place thinks, judging by their clothes, that they were shaman from minor clans, and asks if they even knew what kind of place that was. He states that he had no tea or coffee to serve, as it was strictly a money-holding bank. Jimmu, full of confidence, tells the chubby one to show the treasure. The old man is astonished by the amount of money they had, noting that it was equivalent to what the bank handled in an entire year. The old man was fully convinced they were gods of wealth and members of nobility, and now the bank's chief, Don Grim Wang Jian, bowed before the 3 present there that day. The bank chief, Wang Jian, began work very early, and the 3 shamans were the first in history to open an account at that bank. The protagonist also opened accounts for Chung Sang and the chubby one, just to shut them up from that point on. Daylight was breaking, and Jimmy could feel the freshness of the wind. The master of the Wu family was being informed that Gong Sakya and the Xianyang commercial center had been captured. The previous night, his informant said that the commercial center attempted to carry out an illegal exchange, and Gong Sakya and his gang were fighting against the commercial center. But in the end, everyone was arrested. The head of the family didn't understand why Gong Sakya would interfere in the illegal trade of the commercial center. The head of the Wu family was certain that they had teamed up to set a deadly trap for Jimmy, so he wondered what had happened since then. But his servant had no further information. Now the head of the family knew he was in trouble, and if anyone mentioned they were behind it all, the fact that Jinny had tried to kill a disciple would spread, and with that the bastard would definitely be expelled, having the tendons of his limbs cut. Becoming disabled, the master knew he couldn't let that happen, and had to meet with Lord Gion immediately. He ordered his servant to contact Jinny, check what the shamans were doing, and get rid of all evidence linked to the commercial center. He was willing to make it seem like the idiot knew nothing, and that the Wu family had secretly planned everything alone. Quickly, he took his horse and headed to the location, reflecting that for this he would have to kill Gion, Juxin and Gong Sakyak before they could open their mouths. Inside the disciplinary committee of Dangango, the MC received the news that Li Peiliang was among the bandits, and that his total bounty wouldn't exceed 200 coins. However, they said he would receive a bonus for his efforts. The hero was pleased with his reward, while the man said the reward for reporting smugglers would be delivered personally by John. He was now waiting for Jim, so the protagonist should head there. The protagonist was overjoyed, saying it was the best day ever, having already gone to buy new clothes and gotten a pair of new shoes for free. For some reason, that was the day he would be paid for all the good he had done, until they ran into the head of the Wu family, the root of the problem, who had ordered Jimmy's assassination. As soon as the head of the family saw the MC and his group, he recognized them and regretted finding them there, so he thought it best to act as if he didn't know them, and formally addressed the judge. Asking who they were, then the judge revealed that the night before, the young men were responsible for stopping the illegal gunpowder trade. Just in time, this made the head of the family wonder how the hero had managed to intercept it, and whether Jun Juxin had said anything to them. The judge continued, stating that, in addition, the protagonist had defeated the Sasha clan, which made business owners now adore his name. Jinmu, observing the head of the Wu family, reflected that he could never stop to think about it. He had never heard his voice or seen his face until now, but he still didn't understand why he had issued the order to kill him. Then, the judge remembered that the master also had a son who was a shaman. This sparked tension between the hero and the master, and while the judge tried to remember the son's name, the master said he needed to meet with Jian urgently, so the conversation would have to continue another time, until the judge suddenly recalled that the master's son was Jinny, and he was supposed to be Jimmy Saiyan, an elder in the same position. The master knew he was in serious trouble, now that the protagonist had heard all of this. From that point, Jimmy kindly said he didn't know the master was Jinny's father, and bowed respectfully before him. The hero continued, full of politeness, saying that if the master was going to meet with Gion, they should go together since he needed to talk to him too. This act made the master think that Jimmy didn't know anything, but there was no way he didn't, so all that remained were doubts about what the protagonist was planning. Jian now expressed his gratitude for the MC and his righteous actions, while the master was only thinking about whether Sachik and Jackson had said anything during the interrogation. As Jian mentioned Gong Sakyak, the master knew he couldn't ask directly while they were speaking, until Jian revealed that Gong Zhuiyang said he was ordered by the Wu family to kill Jimma, making the master fall into complete despair. The hero already knew the whole story, while the master now realized that his defeat was inevitable, as he was one step behind everything. To his surprise, Jimmy called the musclehead a liar, saying that Jinny, his Saiyong, would never betray him, and accused Sakyo of making it all up to escape the situation. This attitude sparked curiosity in the master, wondering why the protagonist was taking his side. Jian continues, saying that Jushin claimed Jimmy had used him and taken all his money, but he knew that wasn't true due to the good reputation of the shamans. Jian says that criminals' excuses tend to spiral out of control, and that he didn't want to say it so the hero wouldn't feel bad. He then adds that the landowner showed great appreciation for Jimmy's actions, as the exchange of populations was strictly forbidden. Afterward, he says he wanted to meet him in person. The protagonist replies that he was just happy to have brought peace to the place, and didn't want to be a burden to anyone. Then he turns to Jinny's father and says he was thinking about staying at his house for a while, if it wouldn't be too much trouble. The master couldn't believe the audacity of the protagonist. However, Jim Yu now harbored deep hatred toward that bastard for trying to kill him with the help of his family, just to become the great disciple Eager. The hero says he'd love to kill him as soon as he finds him, but that would be too easy. Besides, a dead person is useless. With that in mind, the protagonist already knew their weakness, so in the future they'd have no choice but to obey him, and so he would use everyone to become the great disciple. Now he could hardly wait for the story's outcome, where he would use Jinmu until the end. The head of the Wu family knew that Jushin and Sakyo had already told everything, and at this point killing them to shut them up wouldn't help. And just by looking at the protagonist's expression, he already knew. Jinmu knew everything and was probably hiding something. While the master brooded unsure of what to do, his servants called him, and he furiously wondered what all the noise was about. Then it is revealed that the protagonist had just invaded his property, and face to face with the master, Jimmy says he had something to say in private, and he orders that all his servants be sent out of the room. The master decides to act friendly, offering a cup of tea, thinking there was nothing that could be used as evidence. But before he could do anything, the hero says that Sachik had a record book, and based on that, if Jimmy showed it to the disciplinary committee and the shamans, and claimed that the Wu family tried to kill him, who knew what would happen. Furthermore, he says, he wouldn't let it slide that Ginny was also aware of everything. But to everyone's surprise, the protagonist had made it all up. There was no book at all. It had only been found in the committee's office, that the fool belonged to the Wu family. But Jean Man knew the master was still hiding something, and could be easily shaken by even the slightest mention of the incident. Faced with this, the master asks what the protagonist wanted to keep him quiet. Jimmy reveals without hesitation that he wants the position of the great Sherman disciple, and for the master to promise that Jimmy would support him in obtaining it. However, the master immediately refuses the offer, saying he was doing everything to make that fool the clan's master, and would never help Jimmy just to stay alive. But the hero says he would never ask for help for free, and that he should listen. Then says that, depending on the help he promises, Jin Hei will become the clan master. From there he reveals that he only wanted to become the great disciple, to obtain the shaman's legendary technique and conquer the world, because becoming the shaman clan master was only an obstacle, but making someone else the clan master, and controlling him from the shadows, like a puppet, would be much more beneficial. However, the clan master questions why anyone would want to become the great disciple, and not the clan master, so he assumes the protagonist thinks he's dumb enough to believe such lies, and in response Jimmy says he hasn't said anything complicated. Getting closer and closer, he argues that he didn't want to create an annoying situation, but he wasn't politely asking the family for help. He had no choice, and with seriousness in his eyes, he says that if the master refused, he would wipe out the entire Wu family. But when the master was about to argue back, Jimmy reveals his dark aura, one of a shadow serpent. The clan master couldn't withstand the overwhelming pressure, and struggled to breathe, realizing that he likely couldn't handle even a fraction of Jimmy's full power caught in that aura. He assumed the protagonist had already reached the projectile arts level, or perhaps was even beyond it. Jimmy then argues again that Gong Saki attacked the commercial center, instead of coming after him, not because he didn't want to kill him, but because he couldn't. From that point, the hero said the master wouldn't understand, until he also felt what the brute had felt, releasing even more of his oppressive and sinister aura. The master questioned what all that was. In the face of such overwhelming power and pressure, the protagonist's gaze was indifferent, and seemed to have witnessed countless wars. It looked like the gaze of a man who had killed many people. The master couldn't believe that such a young shaman could have eyes like those. Then the hero whispered in his ear that he would be waiting for Ginny's help. And after the show, Jimmy calmly walked out through the front doors, left completely helpless. The master concluded that the first-generation disciple, the protagonist, was not a dashi. Moreover, what mattered most was that he wasn't his enemy. Seeing the state of their master, the servants asked if he was all right, and were then ordered to fetch some paper to write a letter to Ginny. The next day, Jimmy and his disciples were back in the shaman's mountains, and the boring lifestyle awaited him. He was greeted by Jinho, who suddenly hugged him, saying that Jimmy had honored the spirit of the shamans with admiration, and when greeting his former disciples, he said that they had also grown a lot. After that, Jinho invited them inside, as the clan master had been waiting for their return. In response, the hero's disciple bowed to the clan elders, and the master along with Chung Wu and Chung Sang. The master thanked them for their deeds, and said he had heard about them through Mr. Jin Yen, emphasizing that without Jinmu, they would have made a huge mistake by not recognizing the true face of the commercial center. He also congratulated the protagonist for taking down the criminals who caused trouble in the alleys, which made the name of the shamans widely known. Jimmy noticed that Ginny had already received her father's letter, but found her stare rather bold. However, the clan master said they couldn't use the money given by the commercial center, and thus returned it to the committee. He then revealed that he knew the protagonist had received a large reward suddenly. Jimmy's master said that the incident at the commercial center was a great misfortune, but he had managed to capture the criminals and secured a reward for the clan. Hearing that the protagonist was shocked, wondering what his master was plotting. He feared that his master would ask him to hand over all the money, but if that happened he would comply, and so it was. The master asked him to give all the money to Master Myung's son, and so he obeyed as he had no choice but to follow the order. There was a place called Sangangam Tomb near Chung-Om Mountain, and this place was quiet and always empty. For that reason Jimmy began using this location as his training base. His goal was to grow stronger and become the great disciple, and afterward dominate the world. He also had strong ambitions to fully understand who the old man was, who had beaten him up. As he calmly reflected on the techniques used by the old man, concentrating his ki to explode it and extending and pulling his hand, he ignored all other methods. From there, the protagonist attempted to replicate the old man's technique, using his energy and his ki with total concentration. He was on the verge of launching an energy projection attack, but unfortunately the attack dissipated upon release, which caused great frustration in Jim. Despite everything, he could imitate the old man's technique, though slightly differently, and once when the hero had been at his peak, he couldn't perfectly replicate it. There were several reasons for this problem, but the main one was his lack of internal energy. The core of his martial art was enlightenment, and the moment someone overcame the wall of pain, their internal energy would increase significantly. So if he didn't reach enlightenment, his energy wouldn't increase by much. But when Jimmy reached that level in his past life, there was no way he could push past the wall of enlightenment again. Technically, he could use all the techniques of the shamans, but he was still very limited due to his low internal energy. His only way out would be to learn the legendary technique of the shamans, but until then, there was a long road ahead. And for now he decided to prepare his master's meal. Jimmy was willing to dedicate all his time to training, in order to accumulate energy, as it was the best he could do for now. Until one day, as the protagonist was approaching the main temple, he spotted Chung Woo and Chung Sang talking. Chung Woo was talking about the money they had saved in the Dongrim Bank, and because the elders were enjoying the money they received so much, he was considering giving all his account money to them. But as soon as Jimmy hears that statement, he kicks the chubby one in the face with all his strength, while punching him repeatedly. The hero says he should never dare to lay hands on his money, and that shaman should never even see that money. Jimmy says he was trying to forget the pain of losing his precious money, but that pig made him remember. And while the protagonist subdues his disciple, his master arrives asking what was going on. He assumes Chung Woo did something wrong. While Jimmy doesn't know what to say, Chung Sang steps in to cover for his master, saying that his senior was just teaching something to Chung Woo. After that, Jimmy asks why his master had left his room, as he was worried about his health. But the master says it was no problem, and so the master reveals that he went out hunting pheasants that day, so everyone could eat. The hero says he could have done that himself if asked, but the master says he was able to do it alone. However, the master was greatly relieved to see that Jimmy was getting better, since after the journey, he seemed very apathetic. Even if the master's health didn't improve, he still thought a lot about him. Little did he know that the hero was apathetic, because he had to give all his reward to those stupid shamans. But suddenly Jinho arrives at the scene shouting for Jimmy and Myanjin. He reports that something was happening right now at the master's temple, making Jimmy and the others question. But Jimmy says they'd only know once they got there, so they should get ready quickly. At the main palace, which serve is the martial arts training ground, Jim is surprised by the number of people there. After that, he notices people taking measurements of several disciples, and becomes confused by the situation, until the clan masters appear, saying all of it was thanks to the protagonist, and that he truly had an excellent disciple. It's revealed that the clothing shop in Dangangwa offered to make clothes for all the disciples, including shoes and hats as a bonus. Jinnu was furious to see that the 200 coins taken from him had been used for such a pointless purpose. But one of the masters reveals that everything was given for free, despite the clan master initially refusing. They said that if it weren't for them, the gang would have taken all the money. To top it off, the blacksmiths of Dangangu said they would forge new weapons for everyone. And one of them says he has more news. They mentioned that the money received from the committee was returned, but even so the amount was sent back again. And upon hearing that the shamans were struggling financially, they all joined forces to give them money. And so the shamans received a total of 500 coins, shocking the hero. And not only that, various other commercial centers contacted the shamans to establish relations, and Jean Gun took on another disciple from Dangangu. I deeply thank Jim, who returned home in glory. However, the protagonist was not the least bit satisfied with the situation, since the bastards from Dangang, who got help from him and were now paying other shamans. He reflected that the clan master would soon receive 500 coins, and that if he had the slightest bit of conscience, he would return his 200 coins. After that, Mei Anjin hugs his disciple, saying he did such a good job and that he was very happy. But Jimmy could only think about his money from then on. All the shaman masters hugged him, and he continued, thinking they were bandits and thieves for not giving his money back. 2 months after returning from the journey, Jimmy remained focused on preserving his inner energy. Meanwhile, the chubby one was mastering the palm strike, and Chung Sang had reached sword ki. Upon seeing that he had reached that level at his age, the protagonist wonders if that was even possible. However, the master says that Chung Sang still didn't compare to Jim Mo, but he was sure he could become the central figure of the shamans in the future. And so he finishes by saying, it was all thanks to Jim Mo's teaching. Faced with this, Jimmy reflects that he had memories from his past life.
As hayokian mugang.
But Chung Sang had none of that and wasn't taught anything. The hero had only taught his disciples because his master asked him to. He merely said a few silly things, and Chung Sang trained and learned on his own. So the protagonist thinks maybe Chung Sang is more talented than he is, and imagines a future where Chung Sang would stop listening and challenge his position once he grew up. Thus, he thinks he shouldn't have taught him anything. Now Jimmy was determined to focus only on the physical training of his disciples, until he is interrupted by the clan masters asking how they've been. While the protagonist asked what brought them there, he wondered if they were going to try taking something from him again. The clan elders said he had been busy lately and hadn't had time to come by, but Jimmy would have preferred that those petty thieves never showed up at all. After that, the clan elder said he had serious matters to discuss with Myung-jin, and told the hero that he should go with them. And when it was mentioned that it also involved Jimmy, a chill ran down his spine. At the meeting, the protagonist was worried. They might have discovered the money he had stashed in the bank, and whether the chubby one had ratted him out. Jimmy's anxiety could have killed him, as he wondered what they came to talk about. Then the clan elder revealed that by decision of the elders, they were going to restore the collapsed Orion Palace. This statement surprised Myung-jin, who was stunned to hear Orion Palace mentioned. He began to cry, saying he never thought he would see Orion Palace restored again. The hero didn't understand why he was crying. Tears of joy over the reconstruction of a mere temple. The clan elder noticed that Jimmy was out of the loop, so he began his explanation. In the territory of the shamans, there were 8 palaces, the main one of Aizo, Yongyun for commandments, Wujin for foreign aid, Yongdong for medicine, Akeo for weapons, Wang Guan for internal house affairs. Finally there was Orion, guardian of the shamans and responsible for enforcing the law. Before the arrival of the hero during the Hananja War, Hananja was the master and Myunjin his main disciple. Oryong Palace had a grand history, but it was burned down by the former Hikong Mugong, and the disciples of Oryong Palace had protected Jeso Palace. Jimmy was embarrassed by the way the old man spoke, and the elder continued saying that on that day, Oryong Palace made a great sacrifice, so they agreed that protecting the shamans was a collective responsibility, not the duty of one palace alone. Thus, he revealed that Orion Palace would be rebuilt and retain its name, and that it would now have the position of Noon Palace. From there, the elder asked if Myung-jin would take over the palace, assuming the role of its master. The elder believed Meong-jin would manage it very well, but Meong-jin merely said that maybe it would be for the best, and so he accepted, but his final words caused confusion in Jemu. The elder said that their current financial situation wasn't enough to rebuild the palace just yet, but Meong-sin would save up as much as possible. Over the next few years, the master told Meong-jin to recover quickly and increase the number of disciples he would take with him to Orion Palace. In the future, turning to the protagonist, the master affirmed that he had many responsibilities ahead of him, and there was no doubt he would one day become the great leader of the shamans. After all that, the elders left the place and Jinmu expressed his thanks, saying that luckily they weren't there about the money. From there, Meong-jin told the hero Chongsang and Chongwu to follow him. Now they stood in front of the ruins of the old Oryang Palace, completely devastated and destroyed. Seeing the place, Jimmy was certain it was the palace he had burned, as it looked very familiar. Meong-jin said he had been the guardian of the shaman's law, and had the duty to uphold it. So while Oryang Palace was the shield that protected the shamans, Nemen Palace was the sword. Nanan Palace was the place with the strongest shamans, playing an important role in disputes related to shamans. In many regions by dispatching warriors, it was the only place where shamans were allowed to kill. Then the master told Jimyu that since he had talent in martial arts, a position in Namin Palace would suit him well. That's when the protagonist understood the meaning behind Meong-jin's earlier words. Having the right to kill wasn't such a bad thing. Now placing his hands on the hero's shoulders, his master said that once the place was rebuilt, he would be known throughout Murim as a disciple of Orion Palace, and the sword of the shamans. He would become their representative and pride. The old man said there was much to be done, and that the protagonist should keep working hard. But he hated the idea that all the tough jobs always fell to him. The master also said that Chongsang and Chongwu should also do their best. While Jimmy lamented being caught up in it all, the hero couldn't accept that, on top of the shamans robbing him, now they were going to exploit his labor too, even leaving him with no time to train. The protagonist planned to make his master reconsider, but Chongsang stepped in. To govern the palace, his master would first need to ascend to the position of great disciple. While Jimmy listened closely, Meong-jin explained that the process of becoming an official in a palace was through the accumulation of merit, and it had been that way for generations. So the protagonist, curious, asks how the qualification to become the great disciple works. Meong-jin, very welcoming, says that it must have already been on his mind as expected, and that it was natural for someone his age to dream of becoming the master disciple, especially given how talented he was. That said, Meong-jin explains that to become the great disciple, it wasn't enough to just be good at martial arts. He also had to fulfill responsibilities. The protagonist needed to earn merits in each palace, and gain prestige among the clans, only then being recognized by the elders, and having his fate decided in an assembly. Upon hearing that, the MC becomes discouraged, realizing that being the strongest wasn't enough to become the great disciple, and he couldn't accept the whole process. Jinwoo was convinced of his progress after surpassing Jin Hyo and Jinny, but now he realized he would have to serve at every palace to reach his true goal. Protagonist bitterly regretted everything. His suffering and even the money he lost had amounted to nothing. He was still unqualified, deeply upset with his master. He exclaims that he should have told him sooner how harsh the qualification requirement was, and the same went for his disciples, who also knew everything and didn't tell them. Frustrated in feeling betrayed by his companions, Jimmy runs off saying that all shamans were frauds. At the top of a mountain, Jimmy reads a letter from his father, saying that he saw with his own eyes that the hero had reached the level of projectile arts. He also reports that Jimmy promised to make him the clan master if he helped him become the great disciple, telling Jinny to support him. However, Jinny didn't believe a word of it after reading the letter multiple times. As the MC was just a beginner a year ago, to Jinny he still ate meat and spoke like a classless man, destroying the dignity of the shamans. Burning the letter, Jinny says it was a joke to think the hero would make him the clan master. He didn't care about that promise at all, and exclaims that he'll kill Jimmy whenever he wants. There would be countless opportunities. Harboring deep hatred, Jenny shouts that the battle isn't over, and that the protagonist shouldn't think he had won. Most of the administrative work was handled by the first generation of disciples, including those who left 7 in total. Jimmy knows it would take many years to rebuild the palace, and feared someone else might become a disciple before it was done. Distressed, he's aware that he needs to rebuild the palace as soon as possible, and also earn merits to qualify as the great disciple. But that would take decades, if the money ended up in the hands of incompetent elders. The protagonist knew he needed to act, but there was no way he used his saved money. Had go insane if the Wu-Tang robbed him again. While racking his brain for a way to get money, Jim has an idea and says he'll have to suddenly head to Dangango. Now the hero is asking Yangjin and the Jeso Palace for permission to go to Dangango. With the master worried, Jim knows that if he wants to leave the temple, he'll need to explain why to the sect masters and elders. Still undecided, protagonist was trying to come up with an excuse until his master, assuming he wanted to drink, asked him to bring back a drink for him too. Yunjin says it's alright, and that he doesn't need permission from the Jeso Palace, so he shouldn't worry about it. The master explains that he is the master of the Orion Palace, and Jimmy is its administrator, so he only needs his permission. The protagonist celebrates the system working in his favor, and tells his master he'll be back soon. Then he quickly grabs his sword and sets off confidently for his final destination, aiming to find the master of the Wu family, the same master who suddenly feels his ears getting hot, suggesting someone was talking about him. With that, the master of the Wu family heads with his servant to the betting pit, managed by the criminal sect. They discovered that the place had been abandoned, since the sect lost its leader, and the treasures inside were still untouched. No one had come to claim them, and there was a great quantity of rare documents and other valuables. Moreover, his servant had found the bride, money that the merchants had hidden inside a small silver box, and finally a phosphorescent pearl the size of a finger, which made the master burst with excitement. The phosphorescent pearl, rare and valuable, would be used as a fund when Ginny took command of the sect. He quickly asks where the servant left the stone, and he replies that it was in his room. The master handed a bag of money to his servant, telling him that after delivering the money, he should go buy drinks for him and his subordinates. The master was thrilled, because it was the perfect time to get his hands on that money. They were in a tight spot, and there would be no problem, since the criminal sect had already been taken down. But when thinking about Jimmy, he needed to ensure his promise of making the idiot the master of the sect would be appalled. And so he wondered what the plan was to make Jimmy the master. That's when he was surprised to find the hero waiting in his room. Saying he looked radiant, the master was startled by the hero, who made a sarcastic comment about his fortune, and said he wanted a favor. After all, he clearly wasn't short on money, so the master asked what he had come there for. But Jimmy said it was nothing too serious. He now revealed that he had come to ask for support in rebuilding Orion Palace, and said he didn't eat much, just enough to complete the construction. The master lost it upon hearing that he was being asked to cover the full cost of rebuilding, mentioning that there would be plumbing involved, and the land wasn't even flat. From that point, the MC said he wasn't some street thug coming to ask for a small amount of money. He had come to request the full investment. Jimmy argued that if the master supported the reconstruction, it would be beneficial not only to his family, but to his son as well. Orion Palace was an important symbol for the shamans, and it would be ideal if Ginny were to fund it entirely by himself. The Wu family's name would be carved into the building, forever honoring their legacy, and elevating the idiot's reputation in the eyes of future generations. And the elders. The master reflected that Jimmy's reputation would rise drastically, considering where he stood now. He knew Jimmy was hiding something. The master said nothing that came from him could be trusted, while Jimmy insisted it was a great long-term investment. And even if Jimmy became the great disciple, his son would become the sect leader. Still skeptical, the master said it was rare for regular disciples to become sect masters. Suddenly the hero suggested making and signing a contract, which piqued the master's interest. Without hesitation, the master ran off, saying that since Jimmy knew his weakness, he had no choice but to do what he said. But by signing the contract, he wouldn't be taking any real loss. He just couldn't be sure the hero wouldn't go back on his promise. However, while the master signed the contract, the protagonist was metaphorically stabbing him in the back and robbing him of all his coins. Jimmy went on to say he wanted his name included when the funds were offered for the palace reconstruction, since he needed a good reputation to become the great disciple. As the master wrote frantically, the hero kept insisting that he also register his help in freeing the merchants and rescuing Wu family members in danger. While the master finalized the contract, the MC told him to come visit when the palace was finished. He would cook him a delicious soup. And when the master finally completed the contract, the protagonist bid him farewell, saying he'd see him later. But as the master went to hand over the contract to Jinmu, he realized there was no one left in the room, leaving him totally disgruntled. After the Wu family sent financial support, the reconstruction moved ahead at full speed. Rebuilding the palace's foundation took a while, but it was finally happening because of the protagonist's deeds. Myung-jin said he should never forget the Wu family's devotion. However, Jimmy said he would help Jinny become the next leader of the set and make sure the family's name was engraved on the palace. That's when the master revealed that they were facing a problem. The food shamans ate was quite different from regular people's, and he was worried whether the builders would have enough strength to finish the job. But the protagonist revealed that he had already asked the chubby guy to prepare the best food and wine for them, concerned for the master's health. Jimmy said the weather was cold and that they should return now, or he might catch a chill. But Min-jin refused, saying he needed to witness the historic moment of the palace, pillars being raised and roofed. Then he handed a scroll to the hero, saying that with the palace being rebuilt, new disciples would come. So he had made a list of martial arts that needed to be taught. Nanjin now ordered Jimmy to go to the library and bring back the martial arts manual. But upon seeing the size of the scroll, the MC realized he would need to bring the entire library tower with him. But to everyone's misfortune, Myung-jin suddenly began coughing, and the hero asked if he was feeling unwell. But Myung-jin revealed his concern, saying he had left out the 10-phase attack manual and the supreme combination techniques. So the master dashed off, saying he would write down all the ones that were missing and that Jimmy should head to the library tower. The hero, seeing all his master's energy, wondered if he was really that sick. He was so fast it looked like he was using the cloud attack technique. Jimmy reflected that seeing his master with so much energy made him happy, but he wondered if that was due to the body's memories, or if he truly felt that way. Now the protagonist considered the possibility that he had changed after assimilating with that body. Now with the task of going to the library, he said he remembered that the tower was managed by Yanjin Palace. The master of the palace was shocked when he saw the size of the scroll that Myung-jin had written. Jimmy looked very pleased to see he wasn't the only one who thought his master had gone crazy. In the end, the master deemed all of it necessary, which made the hero question whether he was really going to lend all those books. Perhaps he was insane too. Myung-gong called for his disciple Jinny, and so he answered and went to the master. He was ordered to deliver the letter to the library tower master, together with the protagonist. With disdain, he simply gave the protagonist a cold look and ordered him to follow. Jimmy reflected that the idiot was still hostile toward him, but that was to be expected from someone who would eliminate his own brothers just to become the great disciple. Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.